In the very early hours of the 27th of March 2003, a 4-year-old boy was lying in his bed in a small farmhouse in rural Ohio. He heard his bedroom door creak open. He figured it was probably just his great-grandparents, Jack and Linda, coming in to check on him like they sometimes did. So, being a little kid, he just squeezed his eyes shut and pretended to be sound asleep. He heard the floorboards groan as whoever it was walked slowly across the room. He could hear them getting closer and closer. And then the sounds stopped. They were standing right next to his bed, looking down at him. He could almost feel them there. His curiosity got the better of him. He opened his eyes, just a tiny crack, just enough to peek. But what he saw standing there in the dark was not his great-grandmother or his great-grandfather. It was a huge green monster. On the evening of Wednesday, the 26th of March 2003, a 55-year-old woman named Linda Myers was driving her car down a quiet, 2-lane road in Darkey County, Ohio. Darkey County was the kind of place that was mostly made up of very small towns, separated by huge stretches of farmland. It was peaceful. As Linda drove, the sun was setting over a wide-open field, casting long shadows across the road. She was on her way home from the pizza shop that she and her husband Jack owned together in a nearby town. It was a normal end to a normal day. Eventually, Linda turned off the paved road and onto a long gravel driveway. This led to the sprawling 40-acre farm where she and Jack lived. She parked her car in front of their old farmhouse, a place that felt like home in every way. She reached into the back seat and grabbed the deposit bag. It was full of the cash earnings from the pizza shop for that day. She got out of the car, and the quiet of the countryside settled around her. The farm was so isolated that you couldn't hear any traffic from the main road. The only sounds were the sheep bleating softly in the pasture and the hum of power tools coming from the big barn out back. She walked around to the back of the barn, and there was Jack. He was hunched over the engine of a beat-up old car, tinkering away. Jack and Linda had been married for about 7 years. This was Linda's third marriage, but with Jack, she truly felt like she had found her soulmate. He was a hard worker. On top of co-owning the pizza shop with Linda, he also had a full-time job at a manufacturing plant. And, as if that wasn't enough, he ran a side business restoring classic cars. Linda often found him out here working on a car as the sun went down. It was just who he was. Sitting in the grass next to the car, playing with a small wrench, was Linda's 4-year-old great-grandson, Damien. The moment Damien saw Linda, his face lit up with a huge smile. He dropped the wrench, jumped to his feet, and ran over to give her a big, tight hug. Seeing Damien's happy face always made Linda feel a little bittersweet. Damien was the son of her granddaughter, Amber. But Amber had gotten pregnant when she was only 14 years old. She was just a child herself and wasn't in any position to raise a baby. So, Linda and Jack had stepped in. They offered to take Damien and raise him for a few years, just until Amber could finish high school and get her life on a stable track. It wasn't a perfect arrangement, and it came with its own set of problems. One of the biggest problems was Damien's father. He was furious about being cut out of the custody agreement and having limited access to his son. Even now, 4 years later, he still argued with Linda about it. He would insist that he wanted to be a part of Damien's life, but Linda was worried. She had a deep fear that he would eventually just abandon the boy, and she couldn't bear the thought of her great-grandson going through that kind of pain. So, she kept him at a distance. Besides, Linda thought Damien was going to have another father figure in his life very soon. In the past few years, Amber had really turned her life around. She had finished school, she had met a wonderful new man, and they had gotten married. Their plan was to take Damien in and raise him themselves as soon as he finished his current year of preschool, which was only a couple of months away. Linda was incredibly proud of Amber and how much she had matured. But she also felt a pang of sadness. She and Jack were going to miss having Damien around the farm. They loved him more than anything. In many ways, he was like their own son. Linda could see that Jack was completely focused on the car engine and probably didn't want to be interrupted. So she just said a quick hello to him, then scooped Damien up into her arms and carried him toward the farmhouse. She opened the back door, set Damien down inside, and told him to go wash his hands for dinner. Then she walked into the kitchen and tossed the deposit bag from the pizza shop onto a chair in the dining room. The bag was full of cash, and her plan was to take it to the bank first thing in the morning. Linda got a pan out and started cooking dinner. A few minutes later, her husband Jack came inside, his hands and arms covered in car grease. While Jack washed up at the kitchen sink, Linda asked him how his day had been. Jack just grumbled a bit. He was annoyed about a customer he'd sold a car to on a payment plan the year before. The customer had now missed 3 payments in a row. Jack said he was going to have to drive out to the guy's house the next day and repossess the car. Linda could tell Jack was tense, but she knew it wasn't just about the missed car payment. The truth was, Jack had been on edge for the past week or so. It all started after he had a huge argument with his 25-year-old son, Greg. Greg had always been a shy, mild-mannered kid who was really close with his dad. He had even been the best man at Jack and Linda's wedding. But recently, Greg's life seemed to be falling apart. He was going through a messy divorce, he was struggling with drinking and drug abuse, and he had been skipping shifts at his job. Earlier that month, Greg had come to the farm asking Jack for money. He said his house was about to be foreclosed on. But Jack had decided it was time for some tough love. He drew a line in the sand and said no. He told Greg that if he wanted to keep his house, he needed to clean up his act and get back to work. That conversation had turned into a massive fight. Now, Linda had a feeling that Jack was genuinely worried he had done permanent damage to his relationship with Greg. He was probably afraid that history was repeating itself. Something similar had happened with Jack's other son, Travis, about 7 years earlier. When Travis was 21, he and Jack had gotten into an argument that was so bad, Travis packed his bags, moved out, and they hadn't spoken a single word to each other since. 7 years of silence. Linda thought Jack must be terrified that the same thing was about to happen with Greg. So, while Jack stood at the sink, scrubbing the grease from his hands, Linda came up behind him and gently rubbed his shoulders. She told him not to worry so much about Greg. She said Greg had a good head on his shoulders and just needed a little push to get back on the right track. That's all Jack had done. She reassured him that he'd made the right decision and that Greg would get through this rough patch. After that, Linda set the table and called everyone for dinner. A little while later, after they had all eaten and cleaned up the kitchen, Linda glanced up at the clock. She realized it was getting pretty late. Damien had preschool in the morning, and she didn't want him to be tired and cranky. So she picked him up and carried him upstairs to his room to get him ready for bed. She helped him change into his pajamas, brushed his teeth for him, and then tucked him into his bed. She gave him a kiss on his forehead, whispered good night, and quietly closed the door behind her. Linda went back downstairs. Before long, she and Jack were getting ready for bed too. A short time later, Linda was in their bedroom. She had a small lamp on. She changed into her own pajamas and crawled under the covers. Once Jack was settled in beside her, she reached over and turned off the light, and the room went dark. Soon, they were both fast asleep. But several hours later, in the middle of the night, Linda was jolted awake by a horribly loud noise. She shot up in bed, her heart pounding. She looked around the dark room, trying to figure out what had happened. When her eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, she saw something that made her gasp. The next morning, at a church just a mile away from Linda and Jack's house, a preschool teacher was getting her classroom ready for the day. As the children started to arrive, she noticed there was one empty chair. One of her students, 4-year-old Damien Huffman, was late. This wasn't totally unusual. She knew Damien's great-grandparents were busy people. They ran a farm, a pizza shop, and a car restoration business. She figured they were probably just running a little behind schedule. So she started the class as usual, hoping they would drop Damien off before he missed too much of the day. About an hour later, around 9:30 in the morning, she was leading the class in their morning sing-alongs. Suddenly, the classroom door burst open and Damien came sprinting inside. At first, the teacher was just relieved to see him. But then she got a closer look. Damien looked frazzled and he was out of breath. He wasn't wearing his backpack. He was still in his pajamas. And there was a smear of something dark and brown on the front of his shirt. She immediately ran over to him and knelt down. As she got closer, she realized the brown spot on his shirt was dried blood. The teacher's heart sank. She gently asked Damien what was going on. He looked up at her with a scared and confused expression on his little face. He told her that his great-grandparents' faces were melting. About 15 minutes after that, a police sergeant named Mark Whitaker and his partner were driving their patrol car down a secluded road toward a farmhouse in rural Ohio. Sergeant Whitaker had been a detective with the Darker County Sheriff's Department for 5 years, and he was the head of the investigative unit. When the department got a very strange 911 call that morning from a local preschool, he was the one sent out to see what was going on. The preschool teacher on the phone had sounded frantic. She said a 4-year-old student named Damien Huffman had shown up for school alone, covered in what looked like blood, and was saying something bizarre about his great-grandparents' faces melting. The teacher gave the police the names of the great-grandparents, Linda and Jack Myers, and their address. Whitaker had no idea what a 4-year-old boy could have meant by that strange phrase, or what kind of scene he and his partner were about to walk into, but he had a very bad feeling about it. They pulled up to the farm and parked at the end of the long gravel driveway. When Whitaker got out of his car, the first thing he noticed was how eerily quiet it was. There was another farmhouse just across the road and a few more scattered on the horizon, but otherwise they were surrounded by nothing but empty fields. It felt completely isolated. Whitaker started walking towards the front of the farmhouse. As he got closer, he saw that the front door was already wide open. He didn't see any obvious signs of a forced entry, like a kicked-in door or a broken lock, but it was still unsettling. Whitaker and his partner reflexively drew their weapons. They stepped carefully over the threshold and into the house. Whitaker called out, announcing their presence, asking if anyone was home. But there was no response. The only sound was the wind whistling through the open door. From where he was standing in the entryway, he could see another open door across the room. It led to a set of stairs going down, probably to a basement. Whitaker decided to ignore the basement for now and focus on clearing the main floor first. He and his partner moved cautiously through the house. They went into the kitchen. It was empty. Once they were sure it was clear, they continued down a hallway until they found a doorway that led into a bedroom. Whitaker pushed the door open and stepped inside. And that's when he found them. Damien's great-grandparents, Jack and Linda Myers, were lying in their bed side by side. It was obvious from the moment he saw them that they were both dead. Jack was lying on his stomach. Whitaker could immediately see a large dark wound on the back of Jack's neck. It looked like a bullet wound. Linda was lying on her back. She had gunshot wounds on her face and on her hand, as if she had raised her hand in a last desperate attempt to defend herself just before she was shot. At this point, Whitaker and his partner did a full, systematic search of the rest of the house just to make sure the killer wasn't still hiding somewhere inside. The house was empty. So the two of them returned to the master bedroom to begin the difficult task of processing the crime scene. Whitaker pulled on a pair of latex gloves and gently touched the wound on Linda's face. The blood was still warm and wet to the touch. Based on that, he figured they had likely only been dead for a few hours at most. He scanned the floor around the bed, looking for bullet casings. He couldn't find any. This told him something important. It meant the killer had been careful. They had taken the time to pick up the spent casings afterwards to cover their track. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was planned. Then, Whitaker's partner called his attention to something strange. There was a weird, plasticky bundle lying on a pillow near Jack's head. Whitaker carefully picked it up. It was a piece of quilting fabric that had been wadded up into a ball and then covered in layers of masking tape. He turned it over in his gloved hands. His best guess was that it was a homemade gun silencer. The killer had probably taped it to the end of their gun to try and muffle the sound of the gunshots. It must have been blown off when they started firing. This immediately raised a question in Whitaker's mind. If this was a silencer, why would a killer even need one? They were out here in the middle of nowhere. The nearest neighbors were far away, but then he remembered who else was in the house. He left the bedroom and went up a flight of stairs. The room directly above where the murders had taken place was another bedroom. This one was filled with stuffed animals and toy trucks. It was obviously Damien's room. And that's when it clicked for Whitaker. The killer must have known there was a toddler sleeping right upstairs. They needed the silencer because they didn't want to wake the child when they committed the murders. And this meant one thing for sure. The killer almost certainly knew Jack and Linda personally. This wasn't a random home invasion. This was personal. Within minutes, more officers from the Darke County Sheriff's Office arrived and began to swarm the property. Whitaker went back outside to supervise them as they set up a perimeter and started their search for evidence. Pretty quickly, a forensics officer called him over. They had found a set of footprints in the soft mud near the side of the house. Whitaker followed the trail of footprints, which led them around the side of the house to a small basement window. The window pane had been carefully pried off, leaving an open hole just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Whitaker crouched down and peered through the opening. Inside, he could see a set of stairs leading up to the main floor of the house. This had to be how the killer got inside. It also explained why that basement door had been standing wide open when they first entered the house. This discovery only made Whitaker more certain that the killer was someone close to the family. They obviously knew the layout of the house. Whitaker told the forensics officer to make a plaster cast of the footprints. With any luck, it would tell them the type and size of shoe the killer was wearing. As Whitaker stood back up, he noticed something else. The phone lines that ran along the side of the house had been cut. The wire was cleanly severed. The killer had planned this meticulously. They had made sure that no one inside the house would be able to call for help. Just then, a pickup truck pulled up at the end of the road. A woman got out and started walking hesitantly toward the house. Whitaker quickly walked over to intercept her, making sure she didn't get too close and contaminate the crime scene. He asked her what she needed. She explained that she was a neighbor who lived at the next property over. She said she had seen all the police cars and didn't know what was going on, but she thought she had some information that might be helpful. The neighbor told Whitaker that around 4:30 that morning, she had been awake and had seen a minivan leaving the Myers farm. It had been too dark for her to see the color of the minivan, but the vehicle itself had stuck out in her memory. As far as she knew, the Myers family did not own a minivan. Hearing this, Whitaker realized this woman may have seen the killer leaving the property. If that was true, it meant the murders most likely happened sometime before 4:30 in the morning. This was a potentially huge piece of the puzzle. He thanked the neighbor for her help. After she left, Whitaker went back inside the house to look for more clues. He really wanted to figure out a motive. He was convinced that whoever did this knew Jack and Linda, but that didn't explain why. Was it a robbery gone wrong? Was it revenge for some old grudge? He didn't know. As he walked through the house, he found that deposit bag full of cash that Linda had brought home. It was sitting in plain sight in the living room. It hadn't been touched. There were also some expensive electronics in the living room, a TV, and a stereo system that were also untouched. This pretty much ruled out robbery as a motive. So Whitaker went back upstairs to take another closer look at the toddler's bedroom. As he scanned the room, he noticed something odd. On the child's bedding, there was a small reddish-brown stain. It looked like a spot of dried blood. While forensics teams were still carefully combing over every inch of the farmhouse, another investigator on the case, a man named Detective Mike Burns, drove to the local preschool. His task was to speak with the only potential witness, 4-year-old Damien. Burns was a father himself, and he felt an immediate wave of sympathy for this little boy who was sitting in a small office looking scared and utterly confused. He knew it was going to be incredibly difficult for Damien to talk about something so traumatic, but he was their best hope of figuring out what had happened to his great-grandparents. Burns sat down on the floor with Damien in a private room. He spoke in a soft, calm voice and asked the little boy to try and explain what had happened that morning. Damien, in the simple way that a 4-year-old talks, said he had woken up around 8:45. The house was very, very quiet. So, he got out of his bed and went into his great-grandparents' bedroom. He said they were both in their bed, and at first, he just thought they were sleeping. But when he tried to wake them up, they wouldn't move. Then, he saw that there was blood on their faces. He said he tried to wipe the blood off with some Kleenex wipes, but there was just so much of it. He realized then that something was very, very wrong. He said he thought for a moment that their faces were melting. And so, thinking he needed to get help for them, he had run the entire mile down the road to his preschool. Burns was amazed that a child so young could remember and articulate so much about such a horrifying experience. He was also grateful. The boy's story explained why there was blood on his pajama shirt. But it still didn't explain the small spot of blood they'd found on Damien's own bed. So, Burns asked Damien if he had gone back into his own room at any point after finding his great-grandparents. But Damien shook his head and said no. He said he went straight out the front door and ran to his school. Burns felt like there had to be more to the story. He just couldn't explain how that bloodstain got onto Damien's bed. So, he brought over a dollhouse and some small toy figures. He asked Damien if he could act out everything that had happened the night before, using the toys to represent himself and his great-grandparents. Damien took the toy that represented himself and put it into a bed in one of the dollhouse rooms. Then he put the Jack and Linda toys into the bed in the other room. He said that everybody went to sleep at their normal bedtime. But then, he said, later, in the middle of the night, he heard his bedroom door open. He said somebody came inside. Burns asked Damien who it was. Damien paused for a long moment, and then he said, "The green monster." At first, Burns wasn't sure what to make of this. He wondered if Damien was just describing a nightmare or if his imagination was running wild. But then, Damien put the toys down. To represent the green monster, he used his fingers, and he made them crawl across the floor of the dollhouse, moving slowly toward his own bed. Damien explained that he had heard the door to his room open, and he had opened his eyes just a tiny bit. He didn't want whoever it was to know he was awake, so he was just squinting. And when he did that, he saw the green monster standing right next to his bed, and the green monster was pointing a gun at him. Damien said he was so scared that he squeezed his eyes shut as tight as he could and just pretended to be asleep. And then, when he finally dared to open his eyes again, the green monster was gone. After hearing this, Burns realized that Damien's memory was almost certainly not a dream. It was all too real. More than likely, Damien had come face to face with the person who killed his great-grandparents. They were the green monster. After leaving the preschool, the next priority for Detective Burns was to speak to Damien's mother, a 19-year-old named Amber Holscher. So, the detective drove out to Amber's house in a nearby town. When he rang the doorbell, she answered right away. At this point, no one in the family had been officially notified about the murders, so Amber had no idea why a detective was suddenly standing on her doorstep. Burns knew this would be difficult, so he gently asked if he could come inside to speak with her. Confused, Amber said, "Okay," and let him in. They sat down in her living room. Then Burns told her as gently as he could that her grandparents, Linda and Jack Myers, were no longer with them. When Amber heard this, she just looked confused. She asked what he meant. "Where are they?" she asked. Burns took a deep breath and had to clarify that they were deceased. Amber looked completely shocked. Her eyes filled with tears, and the first thing she asked was, "Is Damien dead too?" But Burns quickly reassured her. He told her that Damien was alive and safe, but that he was going to be kept in protective custody for a while. They were worried that whoever killed Jack and Linda might try to hurt Damien too. And until they had a suspect, Damien would not be allowed to see anyone in the family, including her, his own mother. At this point, Amber just broke down and started to cry. Burns felt terrible for her, but his main focus was on Damien. He knew he had to solve this case as quickly as possible. Every day that went by was another day that Damien would have to spend alone without any family to comfort him. Based on Amber's genuine shock and her immediate concern for her son, Burns felt it was highly unlikely that she was involved. Damien also hadn't mentioned seeing his mother at the farmhouse, but she might know something that could help them. Once she had calmed down a bit, Burns asked her if she knew of anyone who might have wanted to hurt her grandparents. Right away, she nodded. She mentioned Damien's father, Andrew Huffman. She said Andrew hated Linda because Linda wouldn't let him see Damien. In fact, she said, just recently, Andrew had shown up at Linda's pizza shop and had started a big fight with her about custody. The argument had gotten so heated that Andrew had publicly threatened to kill Linda. This immediately caught Burns's attention. It provided a clear and powerful motive. If Linda and Jack were out of the way, Andrew would have a much easier time getting custody of Damien, so he thanked Amber for her help and promised he would be in touch soon. The moment he got back to his car, he called Sergeant Whitaker and told him what he had learned. Later that day, Whitaker and his partner made the 2-hour drive to Andrew's address in Newport, Kentucky. When they got there, Andrew came to the door and let them inside. He sat down and looked at them, waiting for them to explain why they were there. They told him that Linda and Jack had been murdered, and they watched his reaction very closely. He seemed surprised, but he definitely did not seem upset or sad. Andrew openly admitted that he did not get along with Amber's family. And when Whitaker asked him about the big argument at the pizza shop, Andrew didn't deny it. He admitted that he had, in fact, threatened to kill Linda. But he swore he would never actually do something like that. He said it was just an empty threat made in the heat of the moment. Still, Whitaker thought Andrew seemed very suspicious. So, he asked him for an alibi for the night of the murders. Andrew said he had stayed over at a girl's house that night. In the morning, he had stopped by his dad's house, and then he had gone straight to work. He told them they could ask all of those people, and they would all confirm his story. Whitaker wrote all of this down. He asked Andrew a few more questions, and then thanked him for his time. As soon as the detectives left Andrew's house, they immediately went to go check on his alibi. They drove to the girlfriend's house. Then they went to Andrew's dad's house. And finally, they went to his place of work. And every single person at all 3 locations confirmed Andrew's story. His alibi was solid. Unless all of them were lying, there was simply no window of time where Andrew could have driven 2 hours to Ohio, murdered Jack and Linda, and then driven back. Whitaker was disappointed. They had basically wasted most of the day chasing a lead that now looked like a dead end. And he was very aware that every moment this case went unsolved was another moment that little Damien had to spend all alone away from his family. The following morning, Detective Burns, the same officer who had spoken to Damien and his mother, was sitting in his office feeling very frustrated. He had one main goal for the day. He wanted to find and interview Jack's estranged son, 28-year-old Travis Myers. But it was proving to be much harder than he had anticipated. The day before, other sheriff's deputies had interviewed Linda and Jack's family and friends. Several family members had mentioned that Travis and his father Jack had some very bad blood between them. When Burns had looked into Travis's background, he found that Travis also had a criminal record. But there was a big problem. It seemed like Travis hadn't even been in the state of Ohio for the last 7 years. The last anyone in the family had heard, he had moved to Arizona to live with his mother. But when Burns had called the mother that morning, she said that she actually had no idea where Travis was. There was no other address on record for him. So, Burns basically had no way of finding him. He decided his best bet was to start by visiting Travis's younger brother, Greg. Burns knew Greg lived only a few towns over, and even though he wasn't sure how close the two brothers were, it was the only lead he had. A little while later, Burns showed up at Greg's house and knocked on the front door. A moment later, a young man in a baseball cap opened the door. It was clear from his red, swollen eyes that he had been crying. Burns asked if he was Greg Myers. The young man nodded and stepped aside to let him in. Greg didn't seem surprised by the visit at all. He said the police had already called him the night before to tell him about his father and stepmother's murders. He said that since then, he'd just been waiting for an officer to come by and talk to him. He said he'd seen enough TV shows to know that family members were always the first suspects. But as they walked into the living room, Burns stopped in his tracks. There was another young man standing in the doorway, and he looked a lot like Greg. Burns asked who it was. Greg said, "Oh, that's my brother Travis." Burns couldn't believe his luck. He had come here hoping to maybe get a lead on where Travis might be. He never imagined he would just find Travis standing right there in Greg's house. This was a huge development. Until this moment, Burns had no idea if Travis was even in the state at the time of the murders. But Greg explained that Travis had actually been in Ohio for the past several weeks. He had been staying in an apartment he had rented nearby. Burns thought the timing of this seemed incredibly suspicious. It was just too convenient that Travis had come back to town for the first time in almost a decade, right before his estranged father and stepmother were killed. It just seemed too perfect. And something about the scene just felt off. The two brothers just standing there waiting for the police to come and question them. It didn't sit right with him. So Burns, acting on a gut instinct, told them both that he needed to question them formally. He said they would have to come with him down to the station. Less than an hour later, Detective Burns led Greg and Travis Myers into the Darke County Sheriff's Office. Neither of the brothers was under arrest yet, but Burns had a strong feeling that by the end of their interviews, one or both of them might be. Burns took Greg into his office for questioning, while his partner took Travis into an interview room down the hall. As soon as Greg sat down, Burns noticed that he wasn't making any eye contact. He was fidgeting and acting shifty. But Greg quickly said that he was perfectly willing to tell the detectives anything they wanted to know if it could help them solve his dad and stepmother's murders. So Burns began asking questions. He asked Greg where he was in the early hours of Thursday morning when Jack and Linda were killed. Greg told him that he was mostly just asleep. That is, until about 4:30, when he got up to go to his job at a factory a few towns over. He also said his girlfriend was at home with him the entire night, and she could confirm that. He then said he drove to work in his minivan. He clocked in at 5:23 in the morning, and he even had a signed time card at home that would prove it. Burns was immediately very interested to learn that Greg drove a minivan. Remember, the neighbor had said she saw a minivan leaving the Myers farm around 4:30 that morning, suggesting the killer drove a minivan. However, Burns was starting to realize that even if Greg's alibi was a little shaky, the timing alone seemed to rule him out. It seemed basically impossible to drive from Greg's house at 4:30, go all the way to the farm, commit the murders, then drive all the way to the factory, and still be able to clock in by 5:23. There just didn't seem to be enough time to do all of that. Also, pretty much everyone in the family had told Burns that Greg was actually quite close with Jack and Linda. Yes, he was having some problems with drugs and alcohol, but he had no history of crime or violence, and none of his family members thought he seemed capable of being a killer. So, even though Greg was still technically a suspect, Burns decided to shift his focus to Travis. Burns asked Greg how Travis had reacted when he heard about the murders. Greg said Travis had been upset, but he had mostly been concerned about how Greg was coping, since Greg was the one who was much closer to Jack and Linda. Greg went on to say that it had been at least 7 years since Travis and his father had spoken. He said those two did not get along at all. Burns asked Greg about that big falling out between Jack and Travis. Greg said it all came down to business disagreements on the farm. He said Travis had felt like his father was cheating him out of money. They had a huge argument that got really ugly. After that, Travis had just quit the family business and moved away. Burns thought about this. He wondered if maybe Travis stood to inherit any money if his father died. Because if he did, that would certainly be a solid motive for murder. So, Burns made 2 mental notes. First, check into Greg's alibi more thoroughly. And second, look into Jack's will to see how his assets were supposed to be divided up. After that, he thanked Greg for his cooperation, told him to wait in his office, and then Burns left. He went right down the hall and waited outside the room where his partner was questioning Travis. Later, Burns's partner told him that Travis had seemed really nervous from the moment he stepped into the room. The detective had asked him what he was doing back in Ohio. Travis said he'd just been reevaluating his life recently and realized he had never actually met his brother Greg's children. So, he'd come back to Ohio to do just that and spend some time with them. Then, the detective asked him what he was doing at the time Jack and Linda were killed. Travis stuttered and said he was sleeping in his apartment. The detective asked if he had anyone who could confirm that. Travis hesitated for a moment and then shook his head and said no. Then the detective asked Travis if he had a car. Travis said that at the moment he was driving his mother's car. It was a white minivan. After getting the summary from his partner, Burns went back to his office. By this point, Greg had been moved to a different room. Burns sat down at his desk and began going over the evidence they had collected so far. The investigation had been moving very quickly, so there actually wasn't a whole lot of physical evidence processed yet. It had only been 24 hours since the forensic evidence had been sent to the crime lab, so they were still waiting for results on just about everything. Burns knew that at this point, the best thing he could do while he waited was to follow up on Travis and Greg's alibis. They were the victim's sons, he already believed the killer was close to the family, and they both drove minivans. Really, either of them could be the killer. But just then, Burns's office phone rang. He picked it up. It was a local man who said he had seen a news report about the murders of Jack and Linda Myers. And he had some information that he thought might help. The man said that a few days earlier, a friend of his had called him to ask if he knew where they could buy a gun. And when this man asked his friend why he needed a gun, the friend said it was because he, quote, wanted to shoot Jack Myers. The man on the phone told Burns the name of his friend who had said this, and as soon as Burns heard that name, he knew exactly who the murderer was. Based on that crucial phone call, as well as the forensic evidence from the crime scene, this is what police believe happened to Jack and Linda Myers on the morning of the 27th of March 2003. Early that morning, the killer woke up, got out of bed, and immediately put on a green hunting jumpsuit. They also packed a bag with duct tape, trash bags, and a roll of masking tape. Then they put on a pair of latex gloves and loaded the 12-gauge shotgun they had purchased from a classified ad just 2 days earlier. They carried all of their supplies out to their minivan. After they were ready, they hopped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove a familiar route through the dark, open fields of the countryside. They were calm at first, but as they turned onto the long gravel road that led to Jack and Linda's farm, their heart began to race. The killer felt like they had planned everything out perfectly and had prepared for anything that could possibly go wrong. So now, all they had to do was control their nerves and stick to the plan. The killer parked right outside the farmhouse. Then, while still sitting in the car, they climbed into the backseat of the minivan and grabbed their shotgun. They took a piece of thick quilting fabric, wrapped it around the barrel of the shotgun, and used masking tape to secure it in place. This was their do-it-yourself silencer. But as they did this, the killer's hands were shaking. They were nervous. As much as they had planned for this moment, it really wasn't something they wanted to do. But they felt like they had to. After their gun had its silencer, they slung it over their shoulder. They got out of the van and crept around to the side of the house. Once they were there, they cut the phone lines, making sure nobody inside could call for help. Then they knelt down in the dirt, pried open the basement window, and climbed inside. Once inside the dark basement, the killer walked to the stairs. They went up to the first floor and walked straight to the bedroom where they knew Jack and Linda would be asleep. They went inside. There they were, sleeping in their bed. The killer took a deep breath and then raised the shotgun. They fired a single round into the back of Jack's neck. But the force of the gunshot was too strong for the homemade silencer. It blew right off. So the shot wasn't silent at all. It was extremely loud. The silencer landed on the pillow right next to Jack's head. From the chaos, Linda sat bolt upright in bed. She looked straight at the killer and saw what was happening. She instinctively raised a hand to try and defend herself. In a moment of sheer panic, the killer just turned the shotgun on her. They fired twice. One blast went through her hand. The other struck her right in the face. At this point, the killer just paused and listened. The silencer had sort of muffled the first shot, but the next two were incredibly loud. They knew that noise easily could have woken up the third person they knew was in the house. A person they really didn't want to hurt. But if they had to, they would. So, just to make sure there were no loose ends, they left Linda in Jack's bedroom, confident they were dead, and they crept upstairs to little Damien's room. They went inside, carefully walked over to the boy's bed, raised their shotgun, and aimed it at the child, waiting to see if he was awake. But the little boy appeared to be sound asleep. And so, the killer spared him. They lowered their shotgun and backed out of the room. Once they were back in the hallway, they shut Damien's door and hurried right out of the house. From there, they got back in their minivan and sped off into the darkness. A few miles away, they stopped on a bridge and tossed their gun, their supplies, and their bloody clothes into a river. Then they changed into their work clothes and drove to the factory, where they clocked in at precisely 5:23 in the morning. The killer was Jack's younger son, Greg Myers. Greg had been having serious problems with money and drug abuse. His father, Jack, had refused to bail him out, and they had been fighting about it. Greg knew that he would inherit the farm if his father died. And he was so desperate, he decided that murder was his only option. When police timed the drive from Jack and Linda's farm to Greg's workplace, they found that he would have had just enough time to commit the horrible double murder and then drive straight to work and clock in by 5:23. His alibi was just barely possible. Greg was arrested about 48 hours after the crime. The investigation moved so quickly that police were still gathering evidence to use against him even after he was in custody. They later found the shotgun, the other supplies, and a pair of shoes that matched the prints found in the mud outside the house, all in a river right near the farm. Fingerprints and store receipts tied all of the items back to Greg. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Damien, following the murders, he went to live with his mother, Amber. Despite everything he witnessed at just 4 years old, Amber said in a 2021 documentary that he is now grown up and doing very well. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the 28th of January 1976, a man named Daniel Halseth was born in a small Oregon town called Estacada. It was a quiet place, about 30 miles southeast of Portland, and it was where Daniel learned his first lessons about life. His family owned a farm, and life on a farm means your day starts long before the sun comes up. From a very young age, Daniel was out there with his family, helping with the daily chores. This kind of childhood does something to a person. It instills a really strong work ethic, a sense of responsibility. But more than that, it taught Daniel the value of family. They all worked together, struggled together, and relied on each other to make ends meet every single day. When he got to high school, Daniel really started to come into his own. He had this incredible energy, a big, radiant smile that just naturally drew people to him. He was one of those people who seemed to be good at everything he tried, and he made it look completely effortless. During his high school years, he learned to play both the piano and the drums. His friends and classmates loved his passion for music so much that they gave him the nickname Drummer Dan. On top of that, he was a natural with computers and technology, something that was becoming more and more important in the world. And to top it all off, Daniel was handsome, athletic, and fit. He was the kind of person everyone looked up to, the guy that everybody wanted to be. But even with all of these good things going for him, life dealt Daniel a major blow in 1994. He was in his junior year of high school. A time when you're supposed to be thinking about the future, about prom, about graduation. But that year, his father, who he was incredibly close to, died unexpectedly from a brain aneurysm. For a young man who still leaned on his father for guidance and support, this was an absolutely crushing loss. The heartbreak was immense, but Daniel, just like the rest of his family, found a way to push through the pain and just keep going. A year later, in 1995, Daniel graduated from high school. He packed his things and headed to Salem, Oregon. He went to college there and earned his bachelor's degree in music, keeping that passion alive. But he was also practical. He stayed in Salem, went to another university, and earned his master's degree in business. It was during these years in Salem, while he was building his future, that Daniel met a young woman named Elizabeth Schwarek. She had grown up right there in Salem. And in many ways, she was a lot like Daniel. She was incredibly hardworking and seemed to excel at everything she put her mind to. She was also a model, and when she and Daniel started dating, they looked like something out of a movie, a perfect, beautiful Hollywood couple. In 2001, not long after Daniel had finished his master's degree, he and Elizabeth got married. 5 years went by, and their family grew. They became the proud parents of 3 young children, 2 girls and a boy. Their life seemed to be moving in a wonderful direction. Daniel, with his skill for computers, had founded his own IT company. The business was really starting to take off, and a lot of his clients were based in and around Las Vegas. So, the family made a big move to Nevada. They settled into their new life in Las Vegas, with Daniel's business thriving and providing for his family. But just a few years after they got settled, the focus of the family's ambition started to shift. It would be Elizabeth's career that took center stage. She had always been interested in politics, and in 2010, she decided she was going to run for a state Senate seat in Nevada. This was a huge undertaking. To win, she would need to campaign aggressively, which meant she would be gone from home a lot of the time. This put a huge responsibility on Daniel. He was already working full-time, running the company that paid all the bills. But now he would also have to become the primary parent for their 3 young children. When Elizabeth came to him and laid it all out, she said, "I really want to do this, but it requires a lot from you." Are you willing to do this? Daniel's response was immediate and full of support. He was actually excited for her. He had no problems with the arrangement whatsoever. And so, very soon, Elizabeth was out on the road, campaigning, meeting people, and trying to win that state Senate seat. Back at home, Daniel was juggling everything. He was the one goofing around with the kids, taking them hiking, pushing them on swings at the park. And then, after he tucked them into bed at night, his second workday would begin. He would stay up super late, running his computer business from their dining room table. All the hard work, all the sacrifice Daniel was making for his wife and her dream, it all paid off. Later that year, on November 2nd, Elizabeth won. She had run this incredible campaign that was built on a platform of family values, wholesomeness, and morality. Her victory shocked the state of Nevada. And what was even more impressive was that at just 27 years old, she became the youngest woman to ever be elected to the Nevada legislature. It was clear to everyone, both inside and outside of Nevada, that Elizabeth was a rising star. She was destined for greatness in the political world. And for anyone who knew the Halseth family, they knew that Daniel was her #1 cheerleader. He was so incredibly proud of everything she had accomplished. Their life looked perfect from the outside. But soon, that seemingly perfect life would start to crumble. It wasn't long after Elizabeth had won her election that Daniel began to notice a change in her. She was becoming suspiciously close with another man, a man named Tiger Helgelian. He was a former golf pro and, like Elizabeth, a fellow rising star in the political scene. Daniel noticed his wife was constantly texting with Tiger. It got to the point where Daniel actually reached out to Tiger directly. He begged him to stop messaging his wife, to just leave his family alone. But the texting, the calls, the interactions between Elizabeth and Tiger, they didn't stop. Then came the final blow. In October of 2011, less than a year into Elizabeth's first term as a state senator, Daniel found out that his wife and Tiger had been away together, alone, on a long, extended work trip. The realization hit him hard. It was almost certain that his wife was having an affair. When Elizabeth came home from this trip, she was in their bedroom unpacking. Daniel walked into the room and he confronted her. He accused her of being unfaithful. The argument that followed got very heated, but it never became physically violent. Daniel screamed and yelled at Elizabeth, swearing at her, losing his temper completely in a moment of pure betrayal and hurt. But at some point in the middle of it all, Elizabeth just said, "Daniel, stop," and he did. He stopped yelling, and he left the room. Over the next couple of days, it seemed like they were trying to fix things. Daniel and Elizabeth went to therapy sessions together at their church. It was a clear sign that they were both making an effort trying to salvage their marriage. But on October 21st, just 5 days after that big fight about the affair, Elizabeth went to the police. She claimed that during the argument, Daniel had touched her inappropriately. And so, to Daniel's complete shock, he was arrested. He was charged with something called open and gross lewdness, which is basically a charge for unwanted touching of another person. This particular charge is interesting. It's quite common in certain situations, like at a bar where people are drinking, but it's also known for being one of the more frequently falsely accused offenses. That's because the police don't require any physical proof to make an arrest. It essentially comes down to one person's word against another. Someone can, in theory, get another person arrested just by claiming they were touched inappropriately, even if there isn't a single shred of evidence to back it up. Daniel was found guilty. His sentence was 6 months of probation, and he had to attend anger management classes. But the most damaging part of the sentence was that he now had to register as a sex offender. Shortly after he was found guilty, Daniel filed for divorce. The divorce proceedings were brutal. They were centered on who would get custody of their 3 kids, and it was very bitter and very public. Because Elizabeth was a state senator, she was a public figure. And the foundation of her political career, the campaign she had run, was built entirely on this image of wholesomeness and strong family values. So, when the rumors started flying that she had an affair with Tiger Helgelian, that it had blown up her family, and that her husband was now charged with open and gross lewdness, it was a huge scandal. Despite her denying she ever had an affair and acting like she was the victim, the public pressure was too much. She was forced to resign from her state Senate seat in February of 2012. The divorce was finalized later that year. And because of Daniel's new status as a registered sex offender from that charge, he was denied custody of his 3 children. This was despite the fact that for the last several years, while Elizabeth was building her political career, he had been their everyday primary parent. So Elizabeth got custody of all 3 kids. And what did she do? She promptly left Nevada, took the children, and moved to Alaska to live with Tiger Helgelian, the very man she had denied having an affair with. Shortly after she got to Alaska, she and Tiger got married. For Daniel, it was like his entire world had exploded in an instant. But the most devastating part of it all was that his kids, who he called his 3 little angels, were now so far away. He couldn't even see them if he wanted to. It was a heartbreaking situation. But just like he had done back in 1994 when his father passed away, Daniel somehow found a way to just keep going despite the horrible pain he was feeling. Over the next few years, Daniel poured all of his energy into his computer business. He made it his full-time focus, and it continued to grow. And he made every possible effort to see his children any chance he got. But his relationship with his ex-wife Elizabeth was not good, which made seeing his kids incredibly difficult. Eventually, Daniel met another woman named Bogdana. They got married, and for a while, it seemed to Daniel's family that he was finally starting to get his life back on track. Around this time, Daniel started sharing more of his life on his social media accounts. He made posts nearly every day, and they were always overwhelmingly positive and optimistic. His posts really showcased his wonderful personality. He was all about lifting people up, about being a good human being. And he posted tons of videos of himself just goofing around with his 3 kids. He adored them. They were by far the most important thing in the world to him. But despite this very cheerful outward appearance he projected on social media, privately, Daniel was dealt another very difficult blow. In 2019, his marriage to Bogdana, his second wife, fell apart. And so, once again, Daniel was all alone. His social media posts around the time of this second divorce, they remained positive and optimistic for the most part. But if you looked closely at any picture where Daniel was facing the camera, you could just see this distinct sadness in his eyes. But just as it seemed like Daniel's life was about to crumble again, something truly amazing happened. His first ex-wife, Elizabeth, and their 3 children decided to leave Alaska. They were coming back to Nevada to resettle in Las Vegas. This wasn't because Elizabeth wanted to get back together with Daniel. It was simply because she and the kids liked living in Las Vegas and wanted to return. As soon as they were back, Daniel suddenly got to see his kids all the time. He was so excited, so incredibly happy. In fact, by late 2020, his youngest daughter, Sierra, who was now 16, had basically just moved in with Daniel. Legally, she was not supposed to be doing that, and her mother, Elizabeth, was totally unhappy about it. But that was just how it was. Sierra was living with her dad. In August of that year, around the time Sierra had unofficially moved in, Daniel decided to take Elizabeth back to court. He wanted to see if he could get legal custody of Sierra. She was the only one of their 3 children who was still a minor, and at that point she was already living with him anyway. During the recorded video sessions for the custody hearing between Daniel, Elizabeth, and the judge, Daniel made his case. He told the judge that life in Elizabeth's home was totally toxic and not a good environment for his children, and certainly not for Sierra. He explained to the judge that Sierra was really struggling with some mental health issues. He said what she needed right now was professional therapy, something he had already enrolled her in since she had moved in with him. Daniel also presented a letter to the judge. He said Sierra had written it, and it basically backed up the idea that she was better off living with her father. Elizabeth's response to all of this was to say that Daniel was a liar, that he was not fit to be a parent. She claimed the letter he said Sierra wrote didn't sound like her, insinuating that he had forged it. The judge, who at times got very frustrated with both Daniel and Elizabeth, finally just laid it out for them. He said, "Look, you two have all sorts of issues between you, and it's creating a horrible environment for your kids. If you don't find a way to compromise, the people who are going to suffer are your children, specifically Sierra." Finally, in early 2021, Daniel and Elizabeth still had not come to any agreement, so the judge just made a ruling. He ordered Daniel to return Sierra to her mother's residence because, legally speaking, that's where she was supposed to be. Daniel begrudgingly followed the order. He took Sierra back to her mother's house and dropped her off. But later that same night, Sierra snuck out of her mother's house and just ran right back to be with her dad. And needless to say, Daniel was not unhappy about that. The custody battle over Sierra continued to rage for the next several months. All the while, Sierra chose to stay at her father's place, despite the court order and despite her mother pleading with her to come home. Then, in April of 2021, something very odd happened. On the morning of April 8th, several $100s was withdrawn from Daniel's bank account. The money was taken out from a few different ATMs around Las Vegas. This particular bank account was one that Daniel still shared with his second ex-wife, Bogdana. They just hadn't gotten around to separating it yet. These withdrawals were unusual for either Daniel or Bogdana, so the bank's system flagged them as potentially fraudulent. The bank sent out notifications to both Daniel and Bogdana, letting them know about the suspicious activity. Bogdana got the messages. She knew she hadn't taken out the money, so she tried to call Daniel to see what was going on. But Daniel didn't pick up his phone. So she sent him a text message, but again, there was just silence from Daniel. Thinking this was a little odd, Bogdana decided to reach out to Daniel's mother, Christine. She knew that Daniel and his mom spoke on the phone nearly every single day. She filled Christine in on the situation. After getting all the information from Bogdana, Christine also tried calling and texting her son, but she got nothing back. So, Christine's next step was to try and reach her granddaughter, Sierra. She called Sierra, but Sierra didn't pick up. She sent Sierra a text message asking to speak to Daniel. Sierra didn't get back to her right away, but eventually a text message came through. The response just said, "His phone has been acting up, but he's okay. It should be fixed by tomorrow night, no worries." Now, Christine felt a little bit of relief reading that her son and granddaughter were fine, but at the same time, something just felt off. It was strange that she couldn't get in touch with her son directly. And Sierra was acting a little bit cagey, not answering her phone, which was unlike her. The message itself just didn't quite sound like her. But for the moment, Christine let it go, figuring she would hear from her son within the next day or so. But the next day came, and by 10 in the morning, neither Christine nor Bogdana had heard from or seen Daniel. So Christine reached out to her granddaughter, Sierra, again. She called her, but once more, the call went to voicemail. So she sent Sierra another text message. This time, she was more demanding. She wrote that she needed to speak to her father, and to please put him on the phone. But Sierra did not put her father on the phone. Instead, after a few minutes, Christine just got another text message. It said something like, "My dad's in the shower, so he can't talk right now." At this point, Christine's internal alarms were going off. She knew there was a real problem. She didn't know what it was, but something was wrong. Someone needed to go over to Daniel's house and make sure that he and Sierra were okay. So Christine contacted a woman named Peggy Newman. Peggy was Daniel's landlord, but she was also a close friend of his. Christine asked Peggy if she would mind going over to Daniel's house to do a welfare check. Peggy immediately said, of course, no problem, but told her she wouldn't be able to get over there for at least several hours. Christine said that was fine. But as soon as she hung up the phone, she was just consumed with anxiety. She couldn't stand waiting to find out what was going on with her son. So at 1:46 in the afternoon, with Peggy still out running errands, Christine just called the police herself and asked them to do a welfare check. But as it turned out, just a few minutes after Christine placed that 911 call, Peggy Newman and a friend of hers actually arrived at Daniel's house, getting there ahead of the police. When they got there, they hopped out of their car and walked up to the front door. As they were knocking, they looked over into the driveway and they noticed that Daniel's car, a blue Nissan Altima, was gone. They kept knocking, but the house was completely silent. Peggy reached down and tried the doorknob. She found that it was unlocked. She twisted the knob, opened the door, and she and her friend stepped inside. Just minutes later, Peggy and her friend came running back out of the house. Peggy pulled out her phone and called 911. The police still weren't there yet, and she frantically tried to describe to the dispatcher what she had just seen inside. 24 hours earlier, a young man and a young woman were spotted on surveillance cameras. They were seen withdrawing cash from several Las Vegas ATMs using Daniel's debit card. These were the withdrawals that had been flagged as fraudulent, the ones that had tipped Bogdana off that something was wrong. After making those withdrawals, the man and woman were seen again, this time on camera, at a Las Vegas supermarket called Winco. Inside, they purchased a few items, again using Daniel's debit card. Then they left, and they headed to a Las Vegas Home Depot. And once again, they were caught on camera purchasing a few more items with Daniel's card. After these purchases, the man and woman made their way to Daniel's house, where they would spend the night. The following morning, Daniel's blue Nissan Altima was spotted leaving Las Vegas at around 10:20 in the morning. That was about 3.5 hours before Peggy Newman and her friend went into Daniel's residence, turned around, and ran out to call 911. When police finally did arrive at Daniel's house on April 9th, they pulled up and saw Peggy and her friend on the sidewalk. Their faces were ashen and they were pacing back and forth. The police got out, talked to them briefly, and then went inside Daniel's house. And that's when they saw the horrible thing that Peggy and her friend had seen. But the police couldn't make sense of it. What they were looking at, it just didn't add up. Then, 4 days later, on April 13th, police in Salt Lake City, Utah, just happened to come across the man and the woman who were seen on camera on April 8th, the ones using Daniel's debit card at the Winco and the Home Depot. The police found these two people on a public bus in Salt Lake City. After going through the man and the woman's belongings, including their phones, the police discovered a video. It was a video these two had taken of themselves in the last couple of days, and it explained everything that was found inside of Daniel's house. The young man and the young woman you just saw, joking on camera about murdering someone, were 18-year-old Aaron Guerrero and his girlfriend, 16-year-old Sierra Halseth, Daniel's youngest daughter. Allegedly, on the morning of April 8th, after Aaron and Sierra had pulled all that money out of the ATMs, they drove to the Winco. There, they purchased disposable gloves, bleach, and drop cloths. Then, they had gone to the Home Depot, where they purchased a circular saw, saw blades, and lighter fluid. And then, they headed for Daniel's house. It hasn't been made public exactly what happened inside of Daniel's residence, but we can make a few logical assumptions. Daniel adored his children. That wasn't an act. He truly loved them with all his heart. It would never have crossed his mind that one of his own children or one of their significant others would ever want to hurt him. So, when Sierra and Aaron went inside Daniel's house that day, it would have been extremely easy for them to sneak up on him, to catch him completely off guard. He wasn't looking for a fight. He thought he was around people who loved and respected him because that's how he felt about them. But however the young couple did it, they would inflict up to 70 stab wounds on Daniel's body. Most of those wounds were in the back of his head. At some point during this vicious attack, they stuffed Daniel into a sleeping bag. And right there, in the middle of his own living room, they doused him in lighter fluid and set him on fire. It's unclear what exactly killed Daniel or for how long he was actually conscious and aware of what was happening to him before he died. But it's very possible that Daniel had at least a small moment in time where he recognized that his beloved little angel, Sierra, was actively trying to kill him. After Daniel was either dead or incapacitated, the young couple tossed their pocket knives into the kitchen sink. Then they retrieved their new circular saw, as well as a chainsaw, and they began attempting to dismember Daniel's body. But they were unable to do it. So they just set the saws down in the middle of Daniel's home, with bits of Daniel's flesh still stuck in the grooves of the blades. At that point, Aaron and Sierra attempted to destroy the evidence inside the house. They tried scrubbing everything down with bleach, but it was a totally ineffective cleanup. So then the couple decided they would just burn the entire house down. They figured that would destroy all the evidence. Around the time that Christine texted Sierra and demanded to speak to Daniel, and Sierra wrote back that he was in the shower, that was probably around the time that Sierra and Aaron were actively trying to set the house on fire. But the fire they set wasn't very big. It just kind of smoldered and then went out. So they just left. They left all of the evidence scattered all over Daniel's house. They left Daniel's destroyed and burned body propped up against the door that led into the garage. And they just walked out, hopped into Daniel's blue Nissan Altima, and at around 10:20 in the morning, they left Las Vegas. The only reason police were able to catch Aaron and Sierra in Salt Lake City a few days later was because of a simple mistake. The couple had made their way to Salt Lake City and got on a bus. But Aaron had not paid the fare. He had just snuck on. At some point, the transit authority came through the bus asking people to show their tickets. Aaron didn't have one. When they discovered this, they asked for his name. When they entered his name into their system, it popped up that the Las Vegas Police Department was actively searching for him. While only Sierra knows for sure why she turned on the one man who would have forever loved her and forever supported her, we do know a few things. Around the time that Daniel and Elizabeth were back in court, having those virtual meetings with the judge to decide on custody, Sierra had begun dating Aaron. She had fallen totally in love with him, and it seemed like he had fallen totally in love with her. Somehow, Daniel caught wind of the fact that Aaron and Sierra were secretly planning to run away together and go move to Los Angeles. When Daniel heard this, he told his ex-wife, Elizabeth. Then the two of them went and spoke to Aaron's parents, and they told them about the plan. Both sets of parents talked, and they all decided that it was in both of their children's best interests if they stopped seeing each other. So, starting in early 2021, the parents forbade their children from seeing each other, and that was supposed to be it. But even though all the parents were involved in this decision, because Sierra was living with Daniel at the time, it seemed that she focused all of her rage about this decision on him. He was the one who was there, enforcing the rule. And so, it's believed that in April of that year, Sierra decided she would just have to kill her father in order to get her boyfriend back. In Daniel's obituary, his family very conspicuously left Sierra out. It said that Daniel was survived by 2 loving children, not 3. His family has also come out and publicly stated that they hope Sierra and her boyfriend are given the harshest penalty allowable by law. Despite the existence of the confession video that Aaron and Sierra took of themselves, they have both pled not guilty and are currently awaiting trial. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On paper, Austin Haroof had the kind of childhood most people would envy. He was born on the 21st of December, 1996, to a dentist, father, and a pharmacist mother, and grew up in Palm Beach County, Florida, one of the wealthiest areas in the entire country. It was the kind of place filled with luxury homes, sunshine, and opportunity. By 2021, more than 40 billionaires lived in the county, and for most of Austin's early life, everything seemed stable, comfortable, and normal. But in 2010, when Austin was 13 years old, that stability suddenly cracked. His parents announced they were getting a divorce. For Austin and his younger sister, Haley, who was only a year younger than him, the news was a massive shock. And what made it even more overwhelming was how quickly everything changed afterward. Within that same year, both of their parents had already started new relationships. Suddenly, the life Austin had always known felt completely different almost overnight. Now, of course, this was a huge shock to Austin and to his younger sister Haley, who was only a year younger than him. But, by all accounts, they both adjusted to their new normal relatively quickly. A big part of that was because the kids didn't have to move out. They got to stay in the familiar family home with their mom, which provided a sense of stability. Their father did move out, but he made sure to get a home that was very close by, so he was never far away. The family dynamic had changed, but the core pieces were still there. About a year after the divorce, Austin began high school, and he didn't just attend, he absolutely excelled. From day one, he was placed into all advanced classes, and even within these challenging courses filled with the brightest students, Austin was consistently at the top of his class. He was smart, dedicated, and driven. Austin was also a big athletic guy. He stood at about 6 feet tall and weighed a solid 200 pounds. So, naturally, he gravitated towards sports. He played football for all 4 years. He was in high school, a significant commitment. And for 1 year, his sophomore year, he also took up wrestling. But despite his size and his willingness to play these very rough, very physical sports, Austin was not an aggressive person by nature. In fact, his football coaches actually used to criticize him for not being aggressive enough. On game days, they would try to get him worked up, try to make him mad, hoping that it would inspire him to go out on the field and just smash some people. But it never really worked. Because Austin was just Austin. He was a laid-back, easygoing guy who was actually much more interested in helping people than he was in hurting them. Towards the end of his high school years, this desire to help people became a central focus for him. He became almost obsessed with trying to identify a career path that would allow him to help the most people possible. And he was so genuinely passionate about this that whenever he spoke about it, a huge involuntary smile would just appear on his face. It was impossible to miss his enthusiasm. Because of this, and because of Austin's generally happy and positive disposition, his father very lovingly started referring to him as the happy boy. Shortly before Austin's high school graduation in 2015, a letter arrived in the mail that would set the course for his future. It was from Florida State University, and it was a letter of acceptance, informing him that he had been admitted into their prestigious 4-year pre-med program. Austin had settled on medicine as being the ultimate way he could fulfill his dream of helping people. So, being accepted into this very competitive program was like a best-case scenario come to life. The news sent waves of excitement through the family. Austin and his parents, his sister, they were all absolutely elated. That summer that followed his high school graduation was totally charmed. Austin was on cloud 9, living out the final carefree days before heading off to college. He spent a lot of time with his family, soaking up the moments with his parents and his sister. He hung out with his friends, making memories they would all look back on. Then, finally, at the end of the summer, the day came. His family packed all of his belongings into the car, and they all drove 6 hours north to Tallahassee, where the Florida State campus was located. They helped him move into his new dorm room, setting up his new life. And afterwards, they gave him a big hug, wished him good luck, and they left. I'm sure on that long ride back home, his family members thought to themselves that Austin was doing so great. He wasn't just ready for college, he was ready to be an adult. He was ready to live on his own, to be responsible, to chase his dreams. And at the end of Austin's first year in college, that belief seemed to be entirely accurate. On the surface, he was thriving. Austin got excellent grades in his demanding pre-med courses. He met a nice girlfriend. And even though he wasn't playing organized sports like football anymore, he had found another athletic outlet in bodybuilding. He became passionate about fitness and even built a decent-sized social media presence around his bodybuilding journey. From the outside, he was the picture of success. But underneath all of this public success that Austin was having that year, he was actually struggling. A lot of the time, he just wasn't telling anyone. He kept a journal, and in its private pages, he documented a deep and persistent sense of inadequacy. This feeling was caused primarily by his perception that his peers didn't accept him, that he didn't fit in. And so he would write endlessly about how if he could just stop being so shy, if he could just be more assertive and more outgoing, then more people would embrace him. They would like him. They would finally accept him. Over the course of that year, Austin also started to self-medicate, abusing different substances to cope with his inner turmoil. These included things like alcohol and marijuana, but also Vyvanse. Vyvanse is a powerful stimulant drug typically used to treat people with attention deficit disorder, and he was using it without a prescription. He also began experimenting with hallucinogenic drugs like acid and mushrooms, and he tried MDMA, which is a kind of cross between a stimulant and a hallucinogen, and those are just the drugs that we are aware he was taking. It's entirely possible, even likely, that he was taking other drugs too. So, Austin began to oscillate between these two extremes. He would be on the high of whatever drug or combination of drugs he was on, and then he would crash down to the low of his sober mind, which was a mind totally saturated with anxious and depressive thoughts. Before the end of that first school year, Austin was secretly poised for a full-blown mental breakdown. And it seemed like on some level he knew it was coming, too. In the last month before the end of school, his internet search history paints a terrifying picture of his state of mind. It was filled with desperate questions. Questions like, I think I'm crazy, what do I do, and how do you know if you're crazy? He searched for how to deal with obsessive thoughts. And then there were searches that suggested a complete disconnect from reality. Do I need to sleep? And what happens if you don't sleep? It was clear from these searches that he was starting to seriously question his own sanity. He was lost and scared. When Austin finally returned back home from Florida State for the summer, his family immediately noticed there was something deeply wrong with him. This was not the same happy boy who had left for college less than a year ago. Within just a few days of being home, Austin had moved his bed from his comfortable bedroom down into the family garage. When his family asked him why, he gave them a chilling explanation. He said the house was full of demons. At night, instead of sleeping, Austin would patrol the house. He would literally just walk all around the house all night long, never stopping. And every 2 hours, like clockwork, he would knock on the bedroom doors of his family members. He would knock and then loudly announce that he was guarding them from the demons in the house. Now, you can imagine how his family felt at the time. This behavior was so unbelievably weird, so totally out of character for the Austin they knew, that they just didn't really know what to do. Even though it was obvious that something was terribly wrong, they didn't immediately jump into action. At first, the only thing they did was to just start locking their bedroom doors at night to prevent Austin from coming inside during his strange nighttime patrols. But as the summer progressed, Austin's behavior didn't get any better. He continued to act totally bizarre, totally weird, with no rational explanation. His family became more and more convinced that he must be on drugs. To them, that was the only thing that could possibly explain this complete and total personality shift. So, when they confronted him about his drug use, he would admit it. He told them he was taking drugs, lots of different drugs, psychedelics, stimulants, you name it. And so naturally, his family latched onto his drug use as being the root cause of all his strange behavior. They focused their efforts almost exclusively on that one issue, on trying to get Austin clean again, believing that if they could just stop the drugs, their old son, the happy boy, would return. But towards the end of the summer, something shifted. Austin insisted that he wasn't taking any drugs anymore. But even with that claim, he was still acting totally crazy, totally unhinged. So, around mid-August, the family decided they had to do something more drastic. They decided they had to utilize something in Florida called the Baker Act. Under the Baker Act, individuals who are suspected of having a severe mental illness can be detained for up to 72 hours at the request of their loved one. And during these 72 hours, this individual is thoroughly assessed by medical professionals to see what's going on with them. Then, at the end of those 72 hours, they're given a treatment plan that their family is supposed to help them enact. It was a serious step, but they felt they had no other choice. But before the family could put this plan into motion, something horrific happened. On the morning of August 15th, one of Austin's very close friends, someone he had known since the second grade, got an unexpected visit. Austin just showed up at his house without calling ahead or letting him know, which was very uncharacteristic. The friend opened the door, and Austin just stood there and asked him a single bizarre question. "What year was I born?" The friend, confused, answered, 1996. As soon as Austin heard the answer, he didn't give any reaction to it. He just turned around, walked away, and left. So, this longtime friend is standing in his doorway, watching Austin walk away, wondering what on earth is going on with this guy. Is he high on drugs? Is he drunk? What was that all about? The friend goes back inside his house, and he's thinking to himself, what should I do? After a couple of minutes, he decides he has to call Austin just to make sure he's okay. So he calls him, and Austin picks up. It's unclear exactly what they talked about on the phone, but the friend managed to convince Austin to come back to his house and just spend the day with him. In reality, the friend just wanted to keep an eye on him to make sure Austin was okay. So Austin comes back to the friend's house. Then the two of them would actually leave the house and meet up with some of their other friends who were also in town for the summer. They also met up with Austin's sister, Haley. The group decided they were going to go to the beach for the day. But on their walk to the beach, Austin tells the group that he just needs to get something from his house and that he'll meet them down at the water. At this point, the group believes Austin is more or less fine, maybe just a little off. So they say, "Okay, yep, we'll meet you down there." So Austin breaks off from the group and goes to his house. When he comes back to the beach and meets up with his friends again, he has completely changed his outfit. He was now wearing this very thick, large football jersey. He was wearing long sweatpants that were also very thick. He had on 2 wristwatches, one on each wrist. And he had on sunglasses. As he walks down onto the beach, his friends look up at him. It's super hot out, and they're at the beach in Florida in August. This is a totally weird and inappropriate outfit to have on, and immediately they start kind of giving him a hard time about it, teasing him about his strange outfit choice. But Austin did not think it was funny at all. At first, he was just quiet. But then he kind of lashed out at them and said, "If you tell me I'm crazy, I will kill you." At this, his friends immediately stopped teasing him. Everyone just said, "Okay, man. Hey, didn't mean anything by it. Just giving you a hard time. No big deal." But Austin was clearly worked up, very agitated. So his sister comes over to him and she's trying to calm him down, telling him, "Hey, calm down. It's okay. It's not a big deal." And during this conversation, Austin suddenly seems to go back to being somewhat normal again. He turns to his sister and he says, completely seriously, "I'm actually half horse, and I'm immortal." His sister is just stunned. She looks at him and says, "What? You really need to get professional help. You need to see a therapist or a psychologist or something. Something is wrong with you, and it's been wrong all summer. You need to get help." Now, apparently, Austin actually responded to this very positively. He looked at her and said, I agree. There is something going on, and I do need to get help. You're right. So after that strange exchange, Austin and the rest of the group, they stayed at the beach for several more hours. Then, in the evening time, Austin, his sister, and that same very close friend, the guy who saw Austin in the morning, when he asked what year he was born, they all said they had to leave. The trio leaves the beach and they head to Duffy's, which was a local restaurant in town. They were going there to meet up with Austin's father and his father's girlfriend for dinner. So, as they're getting to this restaurant, they're walking along the sidewalk, getting closer and closer, when suddenly Austin turns to his sister and says, "Hey, I need to test out my immortality." And then he just turns away from her, away from the sidewalk, and starts walking directly into traffic. He was just going to let a car hit him to test if he was truly immortal. His sister, with incredible reflexes, immediately was able to grab him. She pulled him back onto the sidewalk and then basically stood on his left side, physically preventing him from running out into the traffic again. She kind of pushed him along up the sidewalk right up to the front door of the restaurant. And when they got there, Austin had stopped trying to walk into traffic. He was acting normal again. It was there at the entrance that the trio met up with Austin's father and his father's girlfriend. The five of them then went inside Duffy's restaurant. It was about 7:45 p.m. when they got inside. They were very quickly sat at a table in the very back of the restaurant in a booth, and there happened to be a CCTV camera that was watching them while they were inside the building. So they're all sitting at this booth, and about 3 minutes after having sat down, Austin gets up. He walks away from the booth and walks as if he's going towards the bathroom. But then he stops. He doesn't go to the bathroom. He turns around and walks back towards the front of the building, and then he walks right out the front doors. He just leaves the restaurant altogether. Now, it's unclear if the rest of his family at the table saw him do this. It doesn't seem like they did. But just a minute later, Austin comes back inside the restaurant and just walks right back to his table and sits down like absolutely nothing had ever happened. Less than 10 minutes later, Austin would get up again from his table. Except this time, instead of pretending to go to the bathroom, he just walks straight from his table right out the front doors of the restaurant and disappears. A couple of minutes later, Austin's mother, who was not at dinner with them, she was at her home, which happened to be nearby this restaurant. She was home when she heard the sound of someone coming into her house. So she went around to see who it was, and she found her son, Austin, in her kitchen. He was drinking vegetable oil straight from the bottle. And there was Parmesan cheese all over the counter that apparently he had been eating as well. So she runs up to him and she grabs the bottle of vegetable oil and puts it down. She tells him to stop. At which point, Austin does stop. Then, I guess Austin just went up to his room and he changed out of his clothes, perhaps because he got oil all over his shirt. And then his mom just drove him back to the restaurant. She watched him get out of the car and she watched him go through the front door, and then she drove off. So, about 30 minutes after he had left that second time, Austin walks back through the front doors of the restaurant. He's got a different shirt on, a different hat on, and he just walks to the back of the restaurant where his sister, his friend, and his father's girlfriend are, and he sits down, again, like nothing had ever happened. At first, it looks like everyone at the table is just silent. But then Austin's father very clearly said something to Austin, and it seems kind of hostile. It would turn out Austin's father, who loved his son dearly, was just totally at a loss for what to do with him. He was frustrated, scared, and confused. And he said to Austin when he sat back down, "What is wrong with you?" At this, Austin just stands up. He leans across the table and presses his father's face back up against his seat, kind of pinning him there. And then, at some point, he just lets go. He leaves the booth and he walks right out of the restaurant for a third and final time. Austin's friend, who was eating with them, he got up and kind of chased after Austin, but he was about 30 seconds behind him. So by the time he got outside, he didn't know where Austin went. He quickly came back into the restaurant and told the rest of the group he didn't know where Austin was. And so, at this point, Austin's father's girlfriend would actually call the police and report Austin missing. They knew he was totally unhinged, and they had no idea where he was going to go, if he was a threat to himself, or perhaps a threat to someone else. And so they figured they should just tell the police and have the police go find him. About 4 miles away from that restaurant, 3-year-old Michelle Mishcon was sitting in her garage watching TV. Normally, she would be joined by her husband, 9-year-old John Stevens, but he was out walking their dog. So, for the time being, Michelle was alone. The couple had been married for roughly 20 years. Between them, they had 3 children from previous marriages, and they were just totally and completely in love with each other. That garage was like their happy place. It was basically their living room. They loved having the big garage door wide open so they could wave to neighbors as they passed by and flag people down to come have a drink with them or just to chat for a while. They were known throughout the neighborhood as a very happy, loving couple that were just fun to be around. And according to their kids, they had both recently retired. John retired from his landscaping company that he owned, and Michelle retired from her job as a financial advisor. The two of them were apparently both just really excited about retirement life. They were excited to spend more time together and go out with their friends and go out fishing on their boat with their dog. And also to spend as much time as they could just lounging back in their garage. John and Michelle's neighbor, who lived directly across the street, was a middle-aged man named Jeff Fisher. Jeff was fairly close with the couple. He would usually watch their dogs for them anytime they went away on a trip, and he would often go over to their garage and have a drink and just kind of hang out with them. And so on this particular night, he was over in his house and he was planning on going to bed early. So he laid down in his bed, he's getting ready to go to sleep, when he hears some strange sounds coming from outside his window from across the street over near John and Michelle's property. So Jeff sits up in his bed and he kind of strains his ears to try to figure out what it was that he heard. And as he's trying to listen for some faint sound, he suddenly hears a blood-curdling scream, a woman's scream, coming from across the street. So Jeff instantly leapt into action. He jumped out of his bed, he ran downstairs, and he ran out his front door. And he looked across the street, and he saw this unknown man, some young man, that was slamming the car door of Michelle's car that was parked in her driveway. Then this man begins walking up the driveway. And at the top of the driveway, Jeff sees Michelle. She's standing in the garage, and she looks totally terrified. And she's facing this unknown young man. And of course, this unknown young man was Austin Harrouff. Now, Jeff had no idea what was actually going on. All he knew was that he heard this terrifying scream, which was probably Michelle, and he's looking out there and he's seeing a situation that just doesn't look right. It doesn't look good at all. And so, instinctively, he decided he would just run across the street and make sure Michelle was okay. And if he had to, he would confront this unknown man, Austin. So Jeff begins running across his property, trying to get across the street to Michelle. But before he could even get all the way across the street, he's looking up and he can see this guy, Austin, has grabbed Michelle and thrown her on the ground. And now he's on top of her and he's beating her. So Jeff runs onto the driveway, and as he's going right up the driveway, between the two cars that were parked there, Austin leaps off of Michelle. He turns around and he looks directly at Jeff and he says, "You don't want a part of this." Now, Jeff, he's a pretty big guy himself. And so he's looking at Austin and he knows that if he doesn't do anything, this guy is just going to continue pummeling poor Michelle. And he had no idea where John was. So he ran up and kind of lunged at Austin. And as he did that, Austin swung and he hit Jeff right across the side of the head. But Jeff took the hit. He didn't fall down. He grabbed Austin by the collar and threw him as hard as he could to the ground. And Austin, he hit the pavement hard, face first. So Jeff is looking at this guy, kind of thinking he's not going to get up from that. But as he's assessing the situation, watching Austin start to stand back up again, Jeff suddenly feels a blinding pain in his face, in the side of his head, and his neck, on his back. He looks down and he sees blood all over his arms. It's everywhere. He's covered in blood. It would turn out Austin was carrying a knife. And so when he had punched Jeff, that knife went into his face, it cut the side of his head, it cut his neck, and it cut his back. He had 5 different puncture points from that one single swing. And so Jeff believed in that moment that this was a potentially fatal wound. He was worried that perhaps his jugular had been struck and he was bleeding to death. And he's seeing Austin stand back up, coming right after him with this knife. And so Jeff decides their only chance is for him to run and call the police. And so he runs into Michelle's property. He's thinking that he's kind of drawing this guy towards him, away from Michelle. He runs into their property, kind of slams into all their doors. He goes out a back door, and then he loops around the property, and then he makes a run for it, straight across the street, back to his house. He never once turned around to see if this guy was after him. He just figured he was right behind him. He gets to his house, he runs inside, he locks the door, and then he calls 911. The operator asks if either of them are injured, and he says, yes, there's a girl laying on the ground, he beat her up, and then he says he ran over there, and he's bleeding profusely at the moment. The operator asks if he can tell if she's conscious, and he says no, it does not appear so, and that he's been stabbed in the back and is bleeding pretty bad. After the call is placed and Jeff is certain that help is on the way, he's barely conscious. But all he can remember thinking was, I hope this maniac Austin has abandoned his attack and just run off. Or I hope John has come outside and he's helping his wife. But unfortunately, all Jeff could hear was the sound of Austin across the street making these loud, animalistic grunting sounds. And at the same time, he hears the sound of someone screaming at the top of their lungs. He doesn't even know if it's one person or 2 people, if it's male or female. All he hears is screams and grunting sounds. And then, seconds later, the police show up. The following narrative is the account of the second responding officer, who we'll just call Dan. The first responding officer we'll just call Kristen. And so Dan, he comes flying down the street, he's got his sirens on, and he pulls in right behind Kristen's cop car, which is parked right out in front of John and Michelle's property. Kristen is already running up the driveway, her gun is out, and she's getting ready to engage somebody at the top of the driveway. So Dan, he hops out of his car, he's got his hand on his gun, and as he turns to run up the driveway, his view is obscured. There are 2 cars parked in the driveway, and so he can't see what's at the top of the driveway that Kristen is apparently getting ready to draw her gun on. But as he begins running up the driveway, he sees there is this massive 6-foot wide stream of blood just coming down the driveway. So he goes around the left side of the left car, he goes up, and he sees Kristen right at the top of the driveway. She's got her gun aimed at the ground, right in front of the car. So he still can't see what's in front of the car yet. He comes bombing around the left side, right behind Kristen, and he looks down at what she's aiming her gun at. And he sees there's this man lying on the ground. His eyes are open. He's just laying there kind of stiff, and he's looking up at Kristen, he's looking up at Dan, and he's just quietly saying, "Please help me." The man on the ground was John Stevens. And on top of John Stevens was Austin. He was kind of laying sideways on John's chest. He had his left arm wrapped around John's neck to kind of hold him in place. And then he had his right arm, and he was doing something to John's face, but Dan couldn't really tell what he was doing. All he could take in was that there was clearly an aggressor, and they needed to get him off of the victim. But Kristen could not take the shot, because if she did, she ran the risk of firing the bullet through Austin and into John, killing John. So Dan tells Kristen, hold on, I'm going to tase him. And so he moves around Kristen to her left side, so he's positioned looking down at the back of Austin. He pulls out his taser. And right before he shoots his taser into Austin's back, he sees what Austin is doing to John's face with his free right hand. He was reaching into John's mouth and pulling his cheek out, kind of like a fishhook. He was pulling it out as far as he could, and then he was biting into John's cheek, and he was ripping out pieces of flesh and chewing and swallowing them. And from his position, Dan only saw this for a second, but he suddenly noticed, and Kristen, the other officer, would later confirm, there were all these chunks already missing from John's face. So Dan kind of snapped out of what he was seeing and fired his taser into the back of Austin. But it did nothing. It had absolutely no effect. Austin was entirely focused on biting John's face. That was all he was doing. He wasn't even registering that there were cops with their guns drawn on him. It was like they weren't even there. And so Dan runs back around Kristen to the other side of her. He's now on her right side, so he's standing right next to the car, looking down at Austin's front. He tells Kristen to kind of back up for a second, and then Dan winds up and kicks Austin square in the face, knocking his head off of John's face. But as soon as Austin's head comes off of John, he doesn't get up and try to fight with Dan. Instead, he just jumps back down, gets a deeper grip on John, and plunges his mouth back onto John's face. And so again, Dan winds up and boots Austin square in the face, knocking his head back. But again, he's totally unfazed. He doesn't want to attack the officers. He just wants to eat John's face. And so he goes right back down, gets a tighter grip, he goes back, and he starts chewing on John's face again. And so Dan was just repeatedly kicking him in the face over and over and over again. Right as this is happening, another set of officers showed up, and they had a canine. They had a dog. And so they come flying up, they kind of see the situation, and Dan tells them, release the dog. And so, sure enough, they release the canine. The canine clamps down on Austin's right arm, the arm that was fish hooking and kind of pulling John's face out. And the dog really got a good bite on his arm and yanked it away from John's face. But Austin just instantly ripped his arm back, doing severe damage to his own arm from the dog's teeth, and just repositioned himself and went back to biting John's face. And so the dog, just as it was trained, did another bite. It grabbed back onto Austin's arm, and it pulled it off of John's body. And so his arm is back like this again. And Austin, again, completely unfazed, just yanked his arm out of the dog's teeth again, shredding the muscles of his arm, and gets back in position and continues to eat John's face. And then finally, the dog gets another bite into Austin's arm. And this time, when the dog managed to yank Austin's arm away from John, Dan timed it so he booted Austin square in the face right as his arm was being pulled back. And he hit him hard enough that Austin actually flew off of John and landed on his back. And as soon as he was on the ground, Dan actually leapt over John and landed on Austin's face, smashing his head into the cement, which kind of stunned him for a second. And as soon as he was stunned, Dan whipped out his handcuffs, threw it over one of Austin's wrists, and began pulling him by the handcuff up the driveway away from John. But as soon as he had some separation and Dan went to put the other handcuff on Austin, Austin began fighting back. And he looked up at Dan and he screamed, "Kill me! I'm eating humans! Kill me!" Dan didn't even know what to do. And so he's trying to put the other handcuff on him, and the whole time Austin is screaming, "Kill me! Kill me!" And so other officers had to run in, and then finally, after 3 other officers came over, they were able to hold Austin down long enough to get both handcuffs on him. After Austin was finally restrained, the officers checked on the victims. They checked on Michelle, who was in the garage, and unfortunately, she was deceased. She had died from blunt force trauma. And John, even though he had been alive when the police first showed up, he had succumbed to the multitude of injuries he had sustained, from stabbings to beatings to having a portion of his face ripped off. It's believed that after John came back from his walk, which would have been right after Jeff had been attacked, and ran back to his house, John saw Austin in his garage attacking his wife, and John ran in to try to save her. So ultimately, John would die trying to save the woman that he loved. Their dog would survive the attack, it was unharmed, and was given to one of their children to take care of. And Jeff Fisher, the neighbor who tried to save John and Michelle, he would survive the attack and make a full recovery. After Austin was finally handcuffed and was lying restrained on the driveway, he suddenly became unresponsive. He was rushed to the hospital where it was determined that he had drank some poisonous chemicals, most likely from inside of John and Michelle's garage, and that was what was causing his organs to fail. Ultimately, Austin would go into a coma for 11 days from whatever he ingested. But the doctors were able to save his life, and so he would come out of that coma and he would make a full physical recovery. It was initially assumed that because of Austin's known drug abuse history, he must have been on some kind of powerful drug when he perpetrated this heinous crime. It was speculated that he could have been on bath salts or flakka, which are these synthetic hallucinogenic drugs, which are very powerful. And at the time, they were quite popular in Florida and had caused some other users to go on these kind of wild, violent rampages. And so it seemed to make a lot of sense that he must have been on one of those. But when Austin's toxicology report finally came back, it showed he only had a very small amount of THC in his system, which is the drug found in marijuana. And the other drugs that were in his system were all induced by the doctors and nurses at the hospital. Which meant at the time of this horrific attack, Austin was effectively sober. When the police asked Austin, "Why did you do this?" he initially said, "I don't remember. I don't know." But eventually, he would open up and he would tell this story that no sane person could possibly understand. He said that after he left that restaurant where his family was that third time, after he fought with his father and he stormed out, after that he saw this dark figure outside with a white face. And he knew immediately that this figure was evil. And so instinctively, Austin began running away from this evil figure. And so he ran for about 4 miles into John and Michelle's neighborhood. And when he got to this neighborhood, a neighborhood he was not familiar with, that he didn't intend to go to on purpose, he just kind of wound up there. He said he saw this brightly lit up garage, and he ran up into it, believing he could enlist the help of the people inside of this house, and that they would help him defeat this evil figure that was lurking somewhere nearby. And so he runs up into this garage, which happens to be John and Michelle's garage, and Michelle is in there. John is not. He's out for the walk with his dog. And Austin approaches her and tries to get her to help him. But he probably came off looking completely insane. And Michelle screamed. At which point, Austin said he believed Michelle was a witch. And so he pulled out his knife and he attacked her. And then after she fell to the ground, Austin said he drank a bottle of alcohol or something, which we now know was most likely very poisonous lawn chemicals that was just sitting in the garage. After he drinks that bottle, he turns around and now he's looking out of the garage towards the street. And he said he saw this other figure in the doorway with a dog next to him. And then Austin said his mind just went blank. It's believed the figure he saw in the doorway was John Stevens returning from his walk. But we don't know for sure. And frankly, this story is pretty incoherent to begin with because it doesn't account for the fact that before John came back, Austin had been grappling with Jeff Fisher and stabbing Jeff Fisher, the neighbor. But Austin would say he has no recollection of encountering Jeff Fisher. He has no recollection of John or what he looked like. And he certainly doesn't remember biting John's face. And he had no memory of any interactions with police. He said that basically he turned around, he sees this figure, this dog, and then his mind went blank. And then he woke up about 2 weeks later in the hospital. Now, when his story went public, a lot of people just were not willing to accept that story. They said he was making it up so he could plead insanity at his trial and get a lesser sentence. But a world-renowned forensic psychologist named Dr. Philip Resnick, who had worked on many high-profile cases before, he did a lengthy assessment of Austin. And he came to a very different conclusion than the public. In his 3 8-page report, Resnick points out the fact that Austin continued to bite John's face even when he was being openly threatened with being shot by the police officer standing right over him. He continued to bite John's face after he was tased. He continued to bite John's face after he was kicked in the head repeatedly. He continued to bite John's face after a police dog repeatedly bit him. This all suggests that Austin was truly in a psychotic state when this attack occurred. A sane person, even under the influence of drugs, will retain a basic survival instinct. They will try to protect themselves. So when there are guns pointed at them, or they're being physically harmed, or there are threats of violence, they'll do things to protect themselves. But Austin didn't. It was like he had no idea about anything else in the world except John's face. Resnick specified that the type of psychotic episode that Austin was suffering from on the night of the attack is something called clinical lycanthropy delusions. Clinical lycanthropy is a very rare occurrence where an individual believes they are no longer human. And almost always what they believe they are is something akin to a werewolf. And in Austin's case, it's not that hard to figure out why you might reach that type of conclusion. He had told his sister earlier that day that he believed he was half horse. And then on a couple of other occasions, he had told his other friends that he believed he was half dog. And then, of course, on the night of the attack, after he killed Michelle, he pounced literally on John and began eating his face while making those loud animalistic grunting sounds. This is behavior that is certainly on par with what you would expect a werewolf to do in a movie, but this was not a movie. This was real life. After Austin came out of his coma, but before he had been transferred to jail, he agreed to do an interview with the clinical psychologist and TV personality Phil McGraw, better known as Dr. Phil. And during their 10-minute Zoom interview, Austin would break down and cry and say he was incredibly sorry to the family of the victims, that he didn't really know why it happened, and that clearly there was something wrong with him and he needed help. And he just hoped they could find it in their hearts to eventually forgive him. But it's unlikely the family of the victims are going to forgive him anytime soon. Especially when you consider they came out in an interview and said, "I hope Austin makes a full recovery from his coma, that he has no brain damage, that he is totally A-OK, so he can be fully aware and lucid when they read him his sentence." A sentence they hoped would be the death penalty. As of right now, though, the family of the victims will just have to keep on waiting, because Austin is still in jail awaiting trial. Thanks for watching. Cases like this are disturbing not just because of the violence, but because they force us to confront how terrifying the human mind can become when reality completely breaks apart. 2 innocent people lost their lives that night, a family was destroyed forever, and the questions surrounding what truly happened inside Austin Harrouff's mind still remain deeply unsettling to this day. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to check out our other true crime stories next. And as always, let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Until next time. As the Sherman family unloaded boxes outside their new ranch beneath the enormous skies of rural Utah, something appeared at the edge of the property. At first, Terry Sherman thought it was a stray dog. But as the animal slowly walked closer, he realized it was a wolf. An enormous one, much bigger than any wolf he had ever seen before. What made it even stranger was the way it behaved. The animal showed no fear at all. It calmly approached the family and stopped just a few feet away, silently staring at them like it had been waiting for them to arrive. Years later, the Shermans would say this creature was the first warning. Because after moving on to that isolated ranch, they began witnessing things they could never explain. Glowing objects hovering over the fields, cattle vanishing without a trace, strange creatures moving through the darkness, and lights that seemed to open in the sky itself. What they didn't realize on that first day was that they had just moved onto what many people now call one of the most paranormally active places on Earth. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to your next big house party, but be sure to give them the wrong address. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In 1994, Terry and Gwen Sherman bought a 500-acre ranch in northeastern Utah. It was their dream come true. The property had been abandoned for several years, so they got it for a great price. They were cattle ranchers, and all that open land was perfect for their herd. They were so excited to start their new life. When they pulled up to the main house, they weren't bothered by the overgrown grass or the general state of disrepair. They were just happy to be there. But as they started looking closer at the house, they noticed some odd things. Every single window had a deadbolt on it. And every door, not just the ones leading outside, but the doors between rooms, had heavy-duty locks on both sides. Outside the front and back doors, huge metal pikes were driven into the ground with thick chains attached, as if someone had kept very large, very powerful guard dogs. At the time, Terry and Gwen just figured the previous owners were a bit paranoid, being so isolated out in the desert. It didn't seem like a big deal. So, on that first day, as family helped them move boxes from the truck, Terry spotted that wolf. It was still a ways off, moving toward them from a line of trees. Terry was a rancher. He was used to predators. He just calmly pointed it out to everyone. They all stopped and watched as it got closer. Terry noticed it was bigger than any wolf he had ever seen. He judged it to be at least 6 feet long. But it wasn't acting aggressively. It was almost slinking toward them, and as it got closer, it started wagging its tail. It acted like a big, friendly dog. The wolf walked right up to Terry's father and gently nudged his hand. Terry's father, almost without thinking, started petting it. The family just stood there, mesmerized. They didn't feel any fear. Then, just as casually as it arrived, the wolf turned and walked over to a pen where they had a few of their calves. One of the calves had its head sticking through the bars. In an instant, the wolf's friendly demeanor vanished. It lunged and clamped its jaws around the calf's entire head, trying to rip it right out of the pen. The family snapped out of their strange trance. Terry yelled and started firing his pistol at the wolf, but the bullets seemed to have no effect. He and his son ran over, hitting it with the back of an axe, trying to make it let go. The wolf completely ignored them, focused only on the calf. Finally, it gave up, let go of the calf, and started to trot away. Terry grabbed his high-powered rifle and shot it again. Still nothing. The wolf just ambled off into the woods and disappeared. Afterward, they all remembered a horrible, foul, almost chemical smell that lingered in the air. Terry and his son grabbed their guns and went to track the massive predator. They followed its tracks into a muddy patch of ground inside the forest, and then the tracks just stopped. There was no blood, no sign of the animal. It had simply vanished. This was their very first day. The entire family was on edge. They tried to treat it like a normal predator problem, something they had to deal with to protect their livestock. But in the back of their minds, they all knew that what they had seen was not normal. Around the same time, Gwen started having strange experiences that made her worry about her own mind. One day, she came home from the grocery store and put everything away. She went into another room for a minute, and when she came back, all the groceries were back in the bags on the counter. She was just stunned, wondering if she had imagined putting them away. Later that day, she hung her towel in the bathroom before taking a shower. When she got out, the towel was gone. She found it later hanging in a closet on the other side of the house. She seriously started to think she was having some kind of medical problem, maybe memory loss. But then Terry had a similar experience. He was out digging post holes for a new fence with a heavy 70-pound tool. He set it down to go inside for lunch. When he came back out, the tool was gone. He asked everyone in the house, but nobody had seen it. They searched, but it was nowhere to be found. A week later, while patrolling the property, he found it. The 70-pound tool was lodged high up in the branches of a tree, about 70 feet in the air, far from where he'd been working. When he told Gwen, she finally told him about the groceries and the towel. That's when the whole family started to get truly scared. They were isolated, things were happening that they couldn't explain, and those locks on all the doors suddenly seemed a lot more sinister. Soon after, Terry started seeing strange lights on his property at night. At first, he assumed they were headlights from people who had taken a wrong turn. But it kept happening. He started to think it might be illegal hunters. One night, he saw the lights and decided to confront whoever it was. He was angry and marched out toward them. But as he got closer, he realized there was no sound. No engine, nothing. A vehicle would have made noise on the dry ground. As he approached, the lights began to move away from him, still in total silence. Then, they floated up into the sky and vanished. Terry was left standing alone in the dark, completely bewildered. By the spring of 1995, things had gotten much worse. Their cattle were not only disappearing, but sometimes reappearing hours or days later, dead. They looked as if they'd been surgically mutilated with precise cuts and missing organs. At night, the family started seeing tall, shadowy figures walking around the house. They described them as humanoid, but with no faces or expressions. Sometimes, these figures would walk right up to the windows, place their hands on the glass, and stare inside. The family would have all the blinds down and every door and window deadbolted, but they could hear tapping on the glass and strange, unintelligible voices speaking just outside. Sleep became almost impossible. The kids started doing poorly in school. Gwen lost her job at the bank because she was so sleep-deprived. They were all at a breaking point. One evening, Terry was sitting on his porch with his rifle when he saw a new kind of light on the horizon. It was a bright orange orb. He raised his rifle and looked through the high-powered scope. He could see that the orb was like a window or a portal. Inside this glowing orange circle, he could see a bright blue sky, as if he were looking into a world where it was daytime. As he watched, a dark, shadowy figure crawled out of the portal and scurried away into the trees. Then, the portal just closed and disappeared. After that, they started seeing blue orbs. The family said these were the most terrifying things of all. Whenever a blue orb got close, it would create an overwhelming feeling of pure terror and anxiety. One night, Terry was on the porch when a blue orb appeared. His 3 dogs started barking and growling at it. Thinking maybe the dogs could scare it off, he let them go. The dogs charged toward the orb, chasing it into the woods. Terry watched as the blue light retreated into the trees, and for a moment he felt a small sense of victory. Then he heard his dogs start to yelp in pain. He was too scared to go check. He just ran inside and locked the doors. The next morning, when the dogs hadn't returned, he and his son went looking for them. In a clearing in the woods, they found 3 small circular patches of scorched earth. In the center of each was a pile of greasy ash. It was all that was left of their dogs. That was the last straw. Terry decided they had to sell the ranch. He contacted a local newspaper and told his story. By pure chance, a billionaire named Robert Bigelow saw the article. Bigelow was fascinated by the paranormal and had already created a scientific research team called the National Institute for Discovery Science, or NIDS, to study it. He bought the ranch from the Shermans and turned it into the headquarters for his team of highly credentialed skeptical scientists and PhDs. Terry, wanting answers, agreed to stay on as the ranch manager. For the first year, the NIDS team conducted baseline tests. They checked the water for contaminants, the plants for hallucinogens, and did psychological evaluations on the Sherman family. They found nothing. During this time, the ranch was relatively quiet. The scientists concluded that the Shermans were not lying or hallucinating. They genuinely believed they were experiencing these things. Then, the activity started up again. One day, Terry and Gwen were tagging a new calf. They put a yellow tag in its ear and moved on to other animals. About 40 minutes later, their dog started growling and barking at the spot where the calf had been. They looked over and found the calf. It had been completely dissected, with only its head and legs remaining. The incisions were perfectly surgical, and there was no blood anywhere. The ear with the yellow tag had been cut off and was missing. The NIDS researchers swarmed the area. This was exactly the kind of event they were there to investigate. As they searched the property, they noticed that the guard dogs at their observation posts were all cowering, all staring in the same direction toward a line of trees. As the team got closer, Terry shouted that he saw something in a tree. They all looked and saw a massive, humanoid creature with wolf-like features perched on a branch. Terry fired his rifle at it, and the creature scrambled down and vanished into the woods. The team searched, finding a few massive tracks with huge claw marks, but just like the first wolf, the creature had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind that same foul, rotting smell. A few weeks later, Terry and Gwen drove past a corral holding 4 of their prized, expensive bulls. They were all there. The couple drove to another part of the ranch to do some work. When they came back a little while later, the corral was empty. The gate was still locked. There was no sign of a struggle. Panicked, Terry looked around and noticed an old, small trailer nearby that had been wired shut for years. On a hunch, he looked through a window. Inside, crammed into the tiny space, were all 4 bulls, standing perfectly calm, as if in a trance. The trailer door was still wired shut, with old cobwebs undisturbed. It seemed physically impossible for the bulls to have gotten in there. The NIDS team later discovered that a section of the steel bars on the corral had become highly magnetized. The most disturbing encounter the NIDS team reported happened in late 1997. 2 researchers were watching the ranch from a ridge when an orange light suddenly appeared near the homestead below. Through infrared goggles, one of them later described it as looking less like a light and more like an opening in the air. Then they saw something crawl out of it. A dark, human-like figure emerged from the glowing oval and sprinted straight up the hill toward them. As it rushed past only about 30 feet away, the men could hear rocks crunching beneath its feet and smell the same horrible metallic stench witnesses had reported for years. Seconds later, the creature vanished into the darkness beyond the ridge. After 1998, the activity at Skinwalker Ranch reportedly began to fade. By 2004, National Institute for Discovery Science shut down the investigation. Despite years of research, eyewitness testimony, strange magnetic readings, unexplained animal mutilations, and photographs of mysterious lights, they never found definitive proof of what was happening on the ranch. Many of the investigators later said the same thing. Whatever was out there always seemed one step ahead of them, revealing just enough to be seen, but never enough to be understood. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, see ya. Some crimes are terrifying because of the violence. But the cases you're about to hear are frightening for a different reason. In each of these stories, the killer didn't just try to hide what they had done, they inserted themselves directly into the aftermath. They stood beside grieving families, spoke to investigators, acted helpful, calm, even trustworthy, while secretly knowing far more than they should have. In one case, restaurants across an entire town unknowingly served food cooked with water contaminated by a decomposing body hidden inside a water tower. In another, a respected young shaman claimed to use supernatural visions to help police solve a murder, only for investigators to realize the visions were possible because he was the killer himself. And in the final story, a man confessed to murder after claiming he had been attacked by the ghost of the woman he killed. Today, I'm going to tell you 3 true crime cases where the most disturbing part wasn't just the murder itself, but the horrifying lengths the killers went to in order to cover their tracks. On the evening of the 5th of March, 1958, Kasim was sitting inside his home, quietly eating his dinner. The day had been like any other, filled with consultations and remedies. As darkness fell outside, he was just looking forward to a quiet night. But then a sudden, frantic pounding started at his front door. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the sound of desperation. Qasim wasn't expecting anyone, but this kind of thing wasn't entirely unusual. People in crisis didn't always make appointments. So he put down his food, got up from his table, and walked over to the door to see who needed him. When he opened it, he saw 4 men standing on his porch. Their faces were etched with worry. He recognized one of them vaguely, a man from town named Kaur. He'd seen him around, but they didn't know each other well. The other 3 men stood behind Kaur, looking just as anxious. Kaur stepped forward and introduced himself, his voice shaking a little. He explained that he needed Qasim's help. A terrible thing had happened. His wife had gone missing the night before. He said he had spent the entire day searching for her, calling out her name, checking with friends and family, but she was just gone. He was at his wit's end, and someone had suggested he come to the BOMO. He pleaded that maybe Qasim could use his spiritual gifts to help find her. Hearing this, Qasim felt a knot of apprehension in his stomach. He was confident in his abilities as a healer. He knew how to mix herbs, how to perform blessings, how to calm a troubled spirit. That was his world. But finding a missing person was something else entirely. He had never done anything like that before. He didn't want to give these desperate men false hope. So, Qasim was honest with them. He looked at Kaur and said he wasn't sure if he could help, that this was outside of his usual practice. But seeing the raw fear in the men's eyes, he knew he couldn't just turn them away. He told them he would try. With that, Qasim invited all 4 of them into his home. They shuffled into his small living room, which also served as his consultation space. As they took seats on the floor mats, Qasim went into a small back room where he kept his supplies. He returned a moment later carrying a large ceramic bowl filled with charcoal and a small box of matches. He placed the bowl in the center of the room and instructed everyone to sit in a circle around it. He explained what he was about to do. He told them he was going to perform a meditation ritual, one designed to clear his mind and open it up to the energies of the world around them. The goal, he said, was to try and connect with the energy of Kaur's missing wife. If he could find that connection, he might be able to sense where she was. The men nodded, their eyes fixed on him. The room fell silent, filled only with the heavy air of anticipation. Qasim took a match from the box, struck it against the side, and touched the flame to the charcoal. A small orange glow started in the center of the bowl and slowly began to spread, the coals beginning to smolder and release a thin tendril of smoke. Then, Qasim did something that made the other men watch in silent awe. He leaned his head directly over the smoldering bowl and began to take huge, deep breaths, inhaling the thick smoke. He held each breath for a long moment before slowly letting it out. He did this again and again, his eyes closed in deep concentration. The smoke filled his lungs, and he kept going until he felt lightheaded, until the room started to spin, and he felt like he was on the verge of passing out. And right at that moment, just as he felt his consciousness beginning to slip away, an image flashed through his mind. It was incredibly brief, just a split second, but it was vivid. He saw a field, a vast expanse of light green that seemed to stretch on forever under a dark sky. It was just a field, nothing more, but the image was sharp and clear. As quickly as it appeared, it was gone. Qasim snapped his head back, gasping for fresh air, his lungs burning from the smoke. He looked at Kaur and the other men, his eyes wide. He told them he had seen something. He knew where they needed to go. About 15 minutes later, the 5 men arrived at the edge of town. They stood before a huge, sprawling rice paddy bathed in the pale light of the moon. The young rice shoots gave the entire field a distinct, light green color. It was identical to the one Qasim had seen in his vision. Without a word, they fanned out and began to search. They moved slowly through the mud and water of the paddy, their eyes scanning the ground for any sign of a person, any clue at all. The air was still and quiet. After just a few minutes of searching, one of the men suddenly called out. He had found something. Qasim, Kor, and the others hurried over to where the man was pointing. In the middle of the paddy, there was a large pile of straw. It looked completely out of place, like someone had deliberately gathered it and heaped it up. It was big enough to be covering something significant. Hesitantly, one of the men reached down and began pulling away the damp straw. As he removed the top layers, a shape began to emerge from underneath. And then they all saw it. It was Kor's wife. She was lying at the base of the pile, her clothes torn, her body covered in blood. Her eyes were lifeless. She was dead. Within the hour, the police had arrived and secured the scene. The lead officer was a man named J.C. Sabui. He was a practical, experienced policeman who had seen a lot in his years on the force. He listened patiently as Kor and his friends recounted the night's events, including the part about the Bomo and his vision. Sabui was, to put it mildly, skeptical of anything involving magic or visions. To him, it was far more likely that Kasim had simply heard a rumor or stumbled upon the body by chance and then created the vision story to make himself look important. But for now, that wasn't his primary concern. He had a murder to solve. The initial report from the scene was grim. The victim had been severely beaten to death. But there was another key detail. Sabui learned from Kor that his wife had been an avid collector of jewelry and always wore several rings, a necklace, and bracelets. When her body was found, however, all of her jewelry was gone. This immediately suggested a motive: robbery. It was a plausible theory, but Sabui knew better than to jump to conclusions. In cases like this, the husband was always the first person you looked at. So, about 30 minutes later, Sabui was sitting across from Kor in a small, bare interview room at the police station. Kor was still in shock, but he answered Sabui's questions. He told the officer that the night before, his wife had decided to go for a late-night walk by herself. He said it was something she did occasionally to clear her head. She had left the house and simply never came back. When Sabui asked if he knew anyone who would want to hurt her, Kor said no, but he immediately brought up the missing jewelry again. He seemed very insistent that it must have been a robbery, that someone must have attacked her for her valuables. Sabui listened, but he felt a sense of unease. The story about a spontaneous late-night walk felt a little thin. And Kor's eagerness to push the robbery theory felt a bit like he was trying to direct suspicion away from himself. Still, the missing jewelry was a hard fact. It was strong physical evidence that supported the robbery motive. So, Sabui decided to pursue both angles. He would keep a close eye on the husband, but he would also dedicate resources to finding the missing jewelry and tracking down any known thieves in the area. For the next 4 days, the investigation went nowhere. Sabui and his team worked around the clock. They searched the area around the rice paddy again and again, looking for a murder weapon or any other clues. They questioned local informants, trying to see if anyone had heard about a new stash of stolen jewelry being sold on the black market. They re-interviewed Kor, pressing him for more details about his marriage and his wife's habits. But they came up with absolutely nothing. Every lead was a dead end. The case had gone completely cold. Sabui was getting frustrated. The pressure from his superiors and the community was mounting. He felt like he was missing something obvious, but he couldn't figure out what it was. As he sat at his desk on the 4th day, staring at the case file, his mind kept drifting back to the one bizarre element of the whole story: the Bomo, Kasim. Sabui didn't believe in visions, not for a second. But he couldn't ignore the fact that Kasim's so-called vision had led them directly to the body. It was the only break they'd had in the entire case. He felt a bit foolish even considering it, but he was desperate. He had nothing else to go on. He decided that, as a last resort, it couldn't hurt to talk to the shaman one more time. On the morning of March 9th, 4 days after the body was found, Officer Sabui found himself knocking on Kasim's front door once again. When Kasim answered, Sabui explained the situation. He told him the investigation had stalled, that they believed the missing jewelry was the key to finding the killer, but they had no idea where it was. He asked Kasim, since he had been so helpful before, if he would be willing to try his ritual again. Maybe, just maybe, he could see something else that could help them. Kasim seemed reluctant. He told Sabui, just as he had told Kaur, that he was a spiritual healer, not a crime solver. He wasn't comfortable being so deeply involved in a police investigation. But he also acknowledged that he was already involved. His vision had led them to the body, and he felt a certain responsibility to see it through. He told Sabui that he would try. He couldn't promise anything, but he would try. So, for the second time in less than a week, Sabui watched as Kasim prepared his ritual. This time, it was just the two of them in the small living room. Kasim lit the bowl of charcoal and once again began to deeply inhale the fumes, his eyes closing as he entered his trance. Sabui watched, feeling a mix of skepticism and a tiny sliver of hope. After a minute or two of breathing in the smoke, Kasim's body went still. Then his eyes snapped open. He looked up at Sabui and said he'd had another vision. But this time, he didn't describe what he saw. He simply stood up, walked out of his house, and started walking down the street. He told Sabui to follow him. And so began a very strange journey. Sabui followed right behind Kasim as the young shaman walked through the town with a determined pace. It wasn't a random walk. Kasim would walk up to a house, stop in front of it, and just stare at it for a few moments as if he were trying to sense something inside. Then, without a word, he would shake his head and move on to the next house. They did this for what felt like an eternity. They looped through neighborhood after neighborhood, with Kasim stopping and staring at house after house. Hours began to pass. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Sabui's initial hope began to curdle back into his usual skepticism. This was a waste of time. He started to feel like a fool for even coming here. The first vision might have been a lucky guess, but this was clearly just a performance. This was going absolutely nowhere. He was just about to tell Kasim that this was enough, that they were done, when suddenly Kasim stopped again. He stood in front of yet another small, simple house, just like all the others. He stared at it for a long, silent moment. But this time, he didn't shake his head and move on. He slowly turned to face Sabui, and a look of absolute certainty was on his face. He pointed a finger at the house and said, "This is where the jewelry is." Sabui froze. A jolt went through him, a feeling of deep, chilling confusion. Because of all the houses in the entire town that he thought Kasim might stop in front of, this one had never even entered his mind as a possibility. It wasn't the home of a known criminal. It wasn't even the home of a distant relative of the victim. The house that Kasim had led him to, the house he claimed held the key to solving the entire murder, was Kasim's own house. In that single instant, everything shifted. Sabui's frustration and skepticism vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp suspicion. This was not a vision. This was not magic. This was something else entirely. It couldn't be a coincidence. He looked at Kasim, whose face was still a mask of calm confidence, and realized he was looking at his prime suspect. Sabui immediately called for backup. Within minutes, other officers arrived, and they secured the house. Sabui then informed Kasim that they were going to conduct a search of his property. They searched the small house from top to bottom. They looked in every drawer, under every floorboard, in every container. And then, in a small wooden box tucked away in a back room, they found it. A collection of rings, bracelets, and a necklace. It was all of Kaur's wife's missing jewelry. Kasim's plan, whatever it had just collapsed around him. The man who had presented himself as the key to the investigation had just led the police directly to the stolen evidence, which he had hidden in his own home. He was arrested on the spot. Later, at the station, Kasim gave a full confession. The story he told was a chilling departure from the image of the wise, gentle healer he had cultivated. He admitted that on the night of the murder, Kaur's wife had indeed gone for a walk by herself. By a fatal stroke of bad luck, her path had taken her right past Kasim's house. He had seen her, and he had seen the valuable jewelry she was wearing. In that moment, greed had taken over. He attacked her, killing her in the process, and stole her jewelry. Afterwards, he had concocted an elaborate and devious plan to cover his tracks. He took her body to the remote rice paddy and hid it under the pile of straw. He knew that when her husband, Kaur, grew desperate enough, he would likely come to the local boma for help. And that's exactly what happened. Qasim's plan was to discover the body through a mystical vision. This would make him look like a hero, a powerful spiritualist who was helping the community. It would place him completely above suspicion. Who would ever suspect the man who found the body? For a few days, his plan worked perfectly. But his arrogance was his downfall. When the police investigation stalled and they came back to him for more help, he saw another opportunity to reinforce his powers and control the narrative. He thought he could stage another dramatic vision that would lead them to the jewelry. Perhaps he intended to frame a neighbor, or perhaps he believed he could create a story so convincing that the police would think the real killer had planted the evidence in his home to set him up. But leading them on a long, winding tour of the town only to point to his own front door was a fatal miscalculation. The police didn't see a framed psychic. They saw a killer who had made a catastrophic mistake. Qasim bin Osman was tried and convicted of murder. His confession, combined with the discovery of the stolen jewelry in his house, left no room for doubt. He was sentenced to death. The aftermath sent a shockwave through the small town. The man they had trusted with their spiritual well-being, the person they looked to for guidance and healing, was a cold-blooded murderer. It was a betrayal that shook the community to its core, a dark reminder that evil can often wear the most convincing of masks. And in all three cases, the murderers thought they had come up with a perfect cover story. One person hid the body in a place where an entire town inadvertently consumed the evidence. Another pretends to help solve the very murder he committed. And a man became so terrified by what he had done that he eventually confessed to a dead woman whom he claimed had come back for revenge. Thank you for watching. If you liked today's episode, let me know which case made you feel the most uncomfortable. And if you want to hear more true crime stories where reality is stranger than fiction, there's a complete playlist waiting for you right now. See you in the next story. On Sunday afternoon, the 12th of March, 2006, 39-year-old Michael Zamidi Jr., known as Mike, was riding his ATV. In Freedom, New Hampshire, he glided across a huge frozen lake. Mike smiled as the cold air nipped at his cheeks and felt sharp in his lungs with every breath. Totally enjoyed it here. Mike resided in Wakefield, Massachusetts, 2 hours away for most of the year. Freedom was his escape. His parents owned a summer home on this lake, and he had come here his whole life. He felt at home in this tiny, tranquil lakeside hamlet where his real-life stress could melt away. Mike recently took a big stride. His parents lived just down the street from his Freedom vacation home, which he acquired. This purchase was huge for him. It signified his triumph. Mike owned a Wakefield cement contracting business. He spent years creating all-state concrete pumping, countless long days, and restless nights. He wanted to provide his wife, Michelle, and 3 children a good life. This second mansion, this lakeside refuge, proved he had succeeded. He succeeded. Success was costly. His marriage was also deeply strained by his concrete industry work. As boss, he had all the responsibility and brutal hours. He traveled often. This left Michelle and the kids mostly alone. She handled most of the children, housework, and juggling while he worked. She had lately informed Mike that his frequent absence, no matter how much money it brought in, was hurting her and their family. These ideas ran through Mike's head as his ATV skimmed the ice. Success, stress, marriage. He was attempting to comprehend it. He saw it then. He saw another ATV approaching from across the lake. His gut nodded as it approached. He recognized the driver. Sean Fitzpatrick was his other marital issue. Sean was their lakeside neighbor. He was the Zamidi family's close buddy for years. He resided in Freedom year-round after retiring. Sean was always around when Mike and his family visited. He came over for dinner and barbecue. On his boat, he took the kids. Mike's kids called him Uncle Sean because he was so present. Last summer, Mike found something that ended their friendship. He discovered his wife Michelle was cheating with Sean. Mike was devastated by the finding. Everything felt like it had shifted in his universe. Despite the treachery, Steve and Michelle decided to stay married. Still in love, they had 3 kids to consider. They started therapy together to repair things. Mike and Sean had no relationship. Mike hadn't spoken to Sean since learning. Mike disliked conflict. He found it easy to avoid Sean and rebuild his life with Michelle. Mike didn't want Sean coming right for him. He instinctively throttled his ATV, turned it around, and sped off. It was too late. Sean waved him down as he slowed. Mike felt shackled. He reluctantly stopped his ATV and waited for Sean. Sean skipped small conversation. He looked at Mike and stated he was delighted he met him. He wanted to apologize to Mike for last summer with Michelle. He acknowledged it wasn't okay and hoped they could go on. Sean's sincerity surprised Mike. Mike said, "You know what? It's all good," without meaning it because he despised awkward situations. Not everything was good. However, expressing that ended this awkward conversation the fastest. Mike really wanted to leave Sean and return home. He instructed Sean to hurry because Michelle needed him to pack the car. Before Sean could respond, Mike turned his ATV around and drove it back across the ice, leaving him alone on the frozen lake. Mike entered his holiday home 15 minutes later. He observed a row of nicely packed and zipped luggage beside the door first. He smiled within. Michelle had finished everything. Soon after, she entered and kissed him. He was assured the youngsters were finishing up cleaning their rooms and would leave soon. Suddenly, a car horn beeped twice outside. Michelle rolled her eyes and laughed. They both knew who it was. Must be Mike's parents. His parents spent the weekend in freedom at their house down the street. The 2-hour trip back to Wakefield was also planned. Michelle laughed because the family joke was that Mike and his father couldn't go a day without chatting. Michael Sr., Mike's father, shared more than his name. Both father and son were best friends and business partners. Mike Jr. ran Allstate Concrete, owned by Michael Sr. A true family company. Mike had never considered alternatives. He jumped right into the concrete industry after high school and worked with his dad ever since. Like any business, the company struggled over time. Previously, a former employee filed a difficult case. Overall, Allstate Concrete was a success. Today, business was flourishing. Their time and resources were being consumed by a large Boston construction project. Outside, Mike visited his folks and talked shop with his dad. He asked Michael Sr. if he had called Chester Roberts, their employee. Mike asked Chester to join him in the office the next morning with his dad. Chester was their part-time driver and handyman. He was their most reliable worker in his early 50s. Chester was the first person they called during busy weeks. Mike was relieved when his dad claimed he'd spoken to Chester. They were ready for tomorrow. They parted ways after a few more minutes of talking. Mike Jr. assured his dad he'd see him in the morning, then walked inside to pack his family. The next morning, Monday, March 13, Mike Jr. drove his vehicle into Wakefield's Allstate Concrete parking lot before 8. He arrived on time. Being the first, he saw a light rain falling. He jumped out, ran across the wet pavement, and unlocked a side door next to a huge garage bay door. The Allstate building had a huge garage. Their cement trucks could pull through its 3 massive roll-up doors. Mike and his father handled all the paperwork and administrative responsibilities in a small office on the second floor. Mike took the metal stairway to the office after entering the vast, quiet garage. He relaxed into his desk chair and considered the week's itinerary, logistics, and mental to-do list. He heard another car enter the parking lot minutes after. Mike assumed it was his father. Chester was another employee who walked to work. He lived close. Mike then heard the basement door open and footsteps go up the stairs. Another truck entered the Allstate concrete parking lot minutes later. Senior Michael. After parking his truck next to his son's, he ran for the side door to escape the rain. He pushed the door, but it didn't open. It stuck. It opened a few inches. Confused, he looked through the crack to see what was preventing it. His blood chilled. He froze. A man lay face down on the concrete floor in a dark, spreading pool of blood. The garage was dark, so Michael Sr. couldn't see the man's face. He had no idea who it was, but he knew it was not his son with painful certainty. Mike Jr. was a huge, broad-shouldered man, yet even in weak light showed a lesser physique. Michael Sr. felt his heart pounding his ribs. He could only retreat from the door, get his phone, and contact 911. Panic ensued after he hung up with the dispatcher, who promised help. He couldn't wait in the rain. A man was dead or dying in his business. His son was supposed to be there. It was his son's truck in the parking lot. He must enter. Mike had to be found and checked on. Michael Sr. staggered past the blocked side entrance and went to a wide roll-up garage door. He opened it, creating a dark, spacious entrance to the structure. He saw no one in the big garage. Running inside, he screamed his son's name repeatedly. No one answered. Mike! Mike! Just the sound of his furious speech in the vast, empty space. His son was absent from the ground floor. Michael Sr. sprinted for the stairs and took them two at a time to the second-floor office, his heart racing. He froze when he entered the office. The world stopped turning. Mike Jr., his son, was bloodied and collapsed in the office desk chair. After an hour, Massachusetts State Trooper Kevin Baker pulled up to Allstate Concrete in his cruiser. He saw police swarming the enormous industrial facility. Yellow caution tape surrounded the property. At least a dozen Wakefield Police Department crime scene techs and officers collected evidence by entering and exiting an open garage door. Trooper Baker was with the state police, not Wakefield. Massachusetts state troopers led homicide investigations with local police as usual. Baker believed this case needed all the aid it could get. Violence like this wasn't common in Wakefield. It was a lovely, safe hamlet 10 miles north of Boston. In this little village, everyone knew each other. Double homicides were rare here. Baker got out of his car and searched for the leader. His wait was short. Detective Richard Cass of Wakefield Police rushed over and introduced himself. Cass told Baker to follow him to the open garage bay and gave him a quick update. 2 dead men were inside. Both were shot. The company's owner, Michael Zamiti Sr., found them around 8 this morning. Baker followed Cass into the huge garage. They approached the first victim, face down on the concrete floor inside the smaller side door. Cass identified the victim as 5'1" Chester Roberts. Allstate hired him as a part-time truck driver and handyman. It was easy to spot him. Chester was a famous local who did odd jobs around town. He was known to Detective Cass. Baker saw Chester was shot in the back as he kneeled by the body. It appeared to be a shotgun burst. Pellets showed the spray pattern. No other injuries, struggle, or defensive wounds on his hands or arms were apparent. Baker rose and surveyed the garage. He saw no robbery signs. Unused, pricey equipment was outside. Nothing fell or was displaced. Chester's killer seems to have sneaked up behind him and shot him without his knowledge. Baker checked the doors and windows for a while. There were no traces of forced entry again. It didn't matter much. Chester probably opened the building for the day, and the killer followed. After surveying the first floor, Baker told Cass he was ready to visit the second victim upstairs. Baker followed Cass into the second-floor office where 39-year-old Mike Zamiti Jr.'s body was found. Detective Cass whispered that he knew Mike, like Chester. This office scene was awful. Mike wasn't shot once in the torso, like Chester. Shot in the chest and face. Shotgun bursts were catastrophic. Blood covered his desk, chair, and paperwork. Mike was practically unrecognizable. Baker was struck by more than the gruesomeness. Body posture. Mike remained slouched at his desk. It looked like execution. The killer seems to have entered the office with one goal: to kill Mike Simiti. They touched nothing else. They entered and shot him in the face before he could stand up. This was deeply personal and deliberate. Baker developed a theory as he thought about this. Mike Jr. was presumably the first casualty. He was shot before Chester got at the building. Mike would have heard a shotgun explosion downstairs otherwise. He wouldn't have sat comfortably at his desk, surprised. Mike being shot first would strengthen the perception that he was the main target. Other than the awful brutality, the crime scene was tidy. The killer left no bloody tracks, smudges, or traces of searching beyond the victims. Baker quickly considered one idea: Italian-American construction family Zimitis. Fit a stereotype. He told Cass he wondered if this was a professional mob hit. While listening, Cass seemed attentive. He said Baker he knew the Zimitis well and that Mike Jr. and his father were decent people. He didn't think they'd be involved in mafia deals. But he admitted it was plausible, especially because Allstate Concrete was one of the big dig contractors. Baker's ears perked up immediately. The Big Dig was America's largest and most expensive construction endeavor. A Boston Harbor tunnel was a major project. However, the project was a civic nightmare. There were accusations of mafia involvement and corrupt payoffs from the outset, and it was years behind schedule and over budget. Baker now had to consider the possibility that the Zimitis had either become engaged in those shady transactions or crossed the wrong person at work. Baker believed the killer was a business associate, even if this had nothing to do with the mob. Someone who knew the company, building layout, and that Mike would be alone early in the morning was needed. Chester, the second casualty, was probably not intended. Baker wasn't clear why Chester was slain. Due to his late arrival and witness status, he could have been eliminated. He may have been involved in the Zimitis' fight. Baker stood still, scrutinizing the bloody paperwork on the desk. He then told Cass that they needed a thorough list of Allstate's previous and present workers and clientele. While strolling around the workplace, he saw a 1.6 gauge shotgun shell on the floor. He ordered a crime scene tech to bag it and examine the building for more ammunition. Baker and Cassie returned outside. Behind the police tape, a few observers and reporters had gathered. Baker requested Cass to talk with Michael Simiti Sr., the body finder, outside. DCAS shook his head. He said Michael Sr. was disoriented and barely able to communicate when he came due to grief and shock. Cass decided to send him home. When Michelle, Mike Jr.'s wife, arrived, another cop did the same. She hysterically claimed to have heard of an accident. When she learned her husband was dead, they took her home too. Baker accepted but wasn't pleased. Time matters in murder investigations. He preferred to speak to crucial witnesses and family members quickly while their recollections were fresh. He was sorry to miss the chance to talk to Michelle right away because the spouse is always a suspect in homicides. There was still a lot of work to do at the scene, but Wakefield police knew where to find the family. Baker advised Cass to canvass surrounding businesses for witnesses or security cameras. The next morning, March 14, Trooper Baker parked in front of the Simiti family house in Wakefield. He and Detective Cass spoke with Michael Sr. After receiving Chester and Mike's initial autopsy reports, they didn't find anything new. Mike was shot twice, Chester once. Death struck both guys instantaneously. However, detectives had one hopeful lead. No CCTV cameras were detected on the Allstate Concrete facility, but surrounding businesses had them. A team of officers was meticulously scrutinizing the clip. Another Baker team interviewed Chester Roberts' family. He could have been wrong, and Chester, not Mike, was the target. Beyond that, crime scene techs uncovered little physical evidence. There were no usable prints. The morning of the murders, it rained, so they couldn't lift any clear footprints or wheel marks from outside the structure. Now Baker was betting on Michael Sr. He knocked on the main door, hoping the heartbroken father might direct them. Baker and Cass joined Michael Sr. and Pat, Mike's mother, in the Zamidi living room a minute later. Both parents seemed shocked. Michael Sr. was shivering, as Pat sat silently crying. Baker saw them now and felt Cass had made the proper decision to send Michael Sr. home the day before. Even 24 hours later, they were too distraught to give precise answers. Baker opted to be brief. He first requested Michael Sr. to explain the body discovery again. The father gave the 911 dispatcher the same tale, all aligned. Baker proceeded to his actual purpose. He inquired whether anyone wanted to hurt Mike Jr. Michael Sr. shakily breathed. He noted that in the building industry, you sometimes encounter stiff competition. But he and his son always tried to get along with everyone. Fighting was terrible for business, he argued. But as he said this, he sat up taller, as if he had noticed something. He indicated a previous employee had a vengeance against them. It was his nephew, Hank Jennings. Hank sued the corporation a few years ago for unpaid overtime wages. They settled with Hank out of court, but the whole thing had sparked animosity. There was still much hatred. Mike Sr. glanced at his wife Pat, who nodded and said it had been difficult and turbulent. Baker meticulously recorded Hank's facts. After chatting with Mike's parents for a while, he and Cass left. Baker knew he would need to talk to the Zamidis again, but for now, he would give them room. He and Cass had a new lead. They'd investigate Hank Jennings. Baker returned to Cass's Wakefield Police Department office 2 days later to review crime scene images and witness accounts. He was getting restless. After meeting Mike's parents, he hoped Hank Jennings, the bitter cousin, would be their guy. They dispatched officers to find Hank for an interview, but they hadn't found him yet. They had reached Mike's wife Michelle and questioned her at home. She didn't give them much information. She said she was home with her kids when her husband was murdered. She claimed she didn't know anyone who had hurt him. Baker and Cass examined Allstate Concrete's financial records but found no mafia connections. Still, they were better off than a few days earlier. Detectives reviewing surveillance footage from businesses near Allstate discovered something. One security camera faced the street in front of the Allstate building. The angle wasn't right to show the company's parking lot. It recorded all street entry and leave vehicles from the parking lot. Cameras captured Mike Jr.'s truck arriving at work at 7:39 a.m. 5 minutes later, an unknown green pickup truck arrived at 7:44. A few minutes later, Chester Roberts arrived on foot. The same green truck left the parking lot at 7:50. 12 minutes passed before Michael Sr.'s red truck arrived at 8:02. Massive break. The killer probably drove that green truck and killed Mike and Chester between 7:44 and 7:50 a.m. The video quality didn't show the driver or license plate, but knowing the killer's likely vehicle's make and color was crucial. They could narrow their suspect list. Just then, the desk phone rang. Baker watched Cass grab it. After listening, Cass looked confused. He thanked the caller and promised to arrive. He hung up and faced Baker. He claimed Michelle Zamidi was calling. She called to share new information she hadn't shared in her first interview. She said it was crucial. Baker and Cass sat across from Michelle in her living room again 15 minutes later. Baker saw her as a different person. She appeared horrified and grieving 2 days earlier. She looked incredibly nervous now. She fidgeted with a stack of condolence cards on the coffee table, touching her hair. Baker mentioned the cards, and Michelle nodded. Many friends and neighbors from Wakefield and their second home in Freedom, New Hampshire, had reached out. Michelle breathed deeply and got to the point. They were denied information, she said. She described her Freedom neighbor, Sean Fitzpatrick. She acknowledged having an affair with him. Baker was dumbfounded. The case was transformed by a secret love triangle. Sean and Michelle had a strong reason to avoid Mike. Michelle revealed that her husband knew about the affair before Baker could ask a follow-up. She described the therapy and how they had worked hard to save their marriage. She said she broke up with Sean a month ago. She added that Sean was furious. Baker looked at Cass. They shared a thought. They must speak to Sean Fitzpatrick now. Michelle was once again the top suspect after this new information. Maybe she wanted her husband gone to be with her lover. She may have told them this now to control the story before they found out. More evidence is needed to prove any of that. Michelle gave Baker Sean's contact information and address, and Baker said they'd contact her. Later that night, Baker and Cass returned to her office. A second officer was ready to provide a vital update. Baker immediately sent officers to Freedom, New Hampshire to interview Sean Fitzpatrick after speaking with Michelle. One of those officers returned to Wakefield to report his findings. Baker wanted simple answers first. Has Sean Fitzpatrick owned a green truck? Officer shook his head. Sean had a bright red truck, he said. The officer stated that Sean denied having an affair with Michelle when questioned. He said he and Michelle were close, but just family friends. The officers interviewing him never revealed that they knew he was lying, and Michelle had confessed everything. Baker almost laughed at this. He initially doubted Sean's denial. His blatant lying made him look guilty. Before Baker could respond, the officer added another crucial detail: that Sean had a good alibi. One of his neighbors confirmed that he was at home in Freedom on the murder morning. This neighbor took a walk every morning at 9, and she remembered seeing Sean outside his house at that time. In frustration, Baker sighed. Freedom, New Hampshire to Wakefield, Massachusetts takes 2 hours. Sean could not have killed Mike and Chester by 7:50 a.m. in Wakefield and then at his Freedom home an hour and 10 minutes later. Physically impossible. Suddenly, Sean Fitzpatrick, their most promising lead, felt like another dead end. 5 days after the murders, Baker and Cass stood behind a Wakefield church on March 18. They attended Mike Zimiti's funeral. The church was packed, showing how much the community loved Mike. However, the two investigators weren't just paying respects. They finally spoke to Mike's cousin, Hank Jennings, who sued the company. Cass suggested they corner him at the funeral since they hadn't been able to reach him. Despite the animosity, he was family and would attend. Baker felt Cass nudge him as the mourners stood after the service. He leaned over and whispered their accuracy. He pointed to Hank in the crowd. As people left the pews, the two investigators caught Hank before he could leave. Baker immediately saw Hank's body tense up as they blocked his path. He seemed ready to flee. Baker cut to the chase. His eyes widened when he said, "Hank, we need you to come with us and answer some questions." He shook his head and said, "No way." "Not without my lawyer." He pushed past them and left the church. Baker and Cass didn't oppose him. They looked at each other. They considered Hank their main suspect due to his bizarre evasive behavior. 5 weeks passed. State Trooper Kevin Baker sat in Detective Cass's office mid-April 2006. He carefully held a single sheet of paper in latex gloves. The ransom note looked like a movie prop. The page was covered with carefully cut and pasted newspaper letters. The letters warned, "Close business now, or more family will die." They received the note from Mike Jr.'s mother, Pat. She said it arrived in their mail that morning. For the Zimiti family, this letter was terrifying. It wasn't just a cruel reminder of their son's murder, it threatened more violence. The note meant something else to Baker. They desperately needed a lead. Mike and Chester were killed over a month ago, and the investigation had stalled. Most of their initial suspects had been eliminated by this point, including Hank Jennings. They discovered his strange funeral behavior wasn't guilt-related. His settlement with the Zimitis included a non-disclosure agreement, so he was afraid of legal trouble if he told the police. His alibi was solid when they finally got him to sit down for a formal interview with his lawyer. His employer confirmed that he was at work during the murders. Hank owned several shotguns, but none were 1/6 gauge, the type used in the murders. Hank joined the growing pile of suspects. Michelle was in that pile. Given her affair, she had a motive, but she cooperated throughout the investigation. They couldn't find any evidence she was involved, directly or by hiring someone. A seemingly unbreakable alibi cleared her ex-lover, Sean Fitzpatrick, the most suspicious. He could not have been in two places. This threatening, ransom-style note seemed to confirm the investigation's initial theory that the murders were business-related and mob-related. Cass, a local, told Baker that rumors were spreading. Wakefield agreed that the mob theory made the most sense due to the Zamides' Big Dig involvement. Baker wasn't convinced. They repeatedly examined the Zamides' financial records and found no shady deals or mob ties. Additionally, this note felt wrong. A newspaper clipping note was silly and performative, not professional organization style. It seemed like someone was trying to make them think it was the mob to derail the investigation. Even if it was a red herring, the note was shocking. Because the sender may have left fingerprints or DNA on it, Baker carefully placed the note in an evidence bag. Cass sent it to the crime lab for analysis. Baker expected lab results to take time. While they waited, he re-interviewed every suspect and witness in case they missed a small, seemingly insignificant detail. Baker sat alone at Cass's desk a few days later, reading a witness statement for the 100th time. New evidence had re-energized the investigation, and he felt optimistic for the first time in weeks. They received preliminary forensic results from the threatening letter. Better yet, the lab found DNA and a partial palm print on the paper. Now, they needed a suspect to match it. The office door flew open, and an excited Detective Cass barged in. He had news after hanging up the phone. About Sean Fitzpatrick's alibi. The neighbor who walked every morning at 9 a.m. called the station. She wanted to modify her statement. She wasn't sure she saw Sean at 9. She thought she saw him later in the day after thinking about it. One phone call changed everything. A seemingly solid alibi had collapsed. Instantly, the murder day timeline was open. Sean could now have driven from Freedom to Wakefield, murdered, and returned. After realizing this, the investigators remembered another thing. The condolence cards on Michelle's coffee table came to mind. Baker and Cass walked up Michelle Zamides' front steps an hour later. Knocked on her door. They asked for permission to enter and retrieve a small object from her home when she answered. As usual, Michelle agreed, confused but cooperative. After passing her, they found the condolence card they were looking for in that pile. The card was from Sean Fitzpatrick. They thanked Michelle, carefully placed the card and envelope in an evidence bag, and left. The crime lab received it directly. When the test results came back, Baker and Cass knew they had solved the case. Police believe this happened on the 13th of March 2006, based on the new timeline, DNA evidence, and witness statements. Sean Fitzpatrick silently climbed Mike Zamides' office's metal staircase at 7:45 a.m. He carried a 1.6 gauge shotgun and had a racing heart. He was anxious but determined. His mind told him Mike Jr. must go. The only way, he entered the office without hesitation. It opened, and he raised the shotgun. Mike sat at his desk. He turned when the door opened and saw his neighbor, his wife's ex-lover, with a gun pointed at him, shocking and confusing him. Sean shot Mike in the face and chest before he could react. Mike sank in his chair, dead. Sean ran down the stairs, adrenaline rushing. However, he froze at the bottom of the stairs. He heard outside footsteps approaching the building's side door. Others were coming. Sean instinctively hid in the shadows of the large garage, his mind racing to see who it was. A man entered shortly after the door opened. It was Chester Roberts. Sean jumped out of his hiding spot and shot Chester in the back before he could react. Chester fell silently. Sean stood stunned for a moment. He hadn't intended to kill again. Mike alone was targeted. Now another body lay on the floor. He couldn't stay. More people may arrive at any time. He ran from the building and jumped into the green pickup truck he stole from a Freedom neighbor who was away. He left the Allstate concrete parking lot in under 10 minutes. He drove with white-knuckled steering wheel grip. He felt terrible about what he did and knew he should feel guilty. However, he only felt profound relief. Now, he believed he could be with his soulmate. When Michelle tried to break up with Sean, she told him she would only leave her husband if Mike did or suffered. Michelle did it to end the affair and let him down easy. Sean saw it as a suggestion and green light. So he did something to Mike. The pieces fell into place after Sean's alibi collapsed. He licked the envelope of his condolence card to Michelle, leaving DNA that matched the ransom-style letter. Sean wrote and sent that letter to deceive the police into thinking the murders were a professional mob hit. June 2006 saw Sean Fitzpatrick arrested. After being convicted of murdering Michael Zamiti Jr. and Chester Roberts, he received 2 life sentences. The Zamiti family had to deal with the loss of their son and the betrayal of a friend. Chester Roberts' family mourned an innocent man who was killed for arriving on time to work. Many thanks for watching. Comment your thoughts on today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time. See you. One afternoon in early September of 2004, a 20-year-old student named Derek Keeper sat alone in the newspaper lab at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, furiously typing an opinion article that he believed would make people angry. Years later, people would look back on those exact words and realize something terrifying. Because without knowing it, Derek was writing about the very thing that would eventually kill him. And, strangely, Derek's story would not be the only one like that. Years later, on the other side of the world, another man would confidently make a decision he believed would impress everyone around him. Instead, that single decision would trap thousands of people inside a sinking cruise ship in the middle of the night. At first, these two stories seem completely unrelated. One is about a college student in Nebraska. The other is about the captain of a luxury cruise ship off the coast of Italy. But both men shared the exact same dangerous belief. They were absolutely convinced they were right. And even when warning signs appeared directly in front of them, neither one backed down. So what happens when confidence slowly turns into recklessness? And how can a single decision, made in just a few seconds, quietly set the stage for disaster long before anyone realizes what's coming? Derek was the kind of person who was involved in everything. He was a member of a fraternity. He was also a senator in the student government, where he was known for his passionate arguments and strong opinions. On top of that, he worked as a research assistant for the university library. And somehow, he was also pursuing 5 different majors. It seemed like he was trying to do everything all at once. Derek took every single one of his commitments very, very seriously. He was not the kind of person to do something halfway. But the column he was writing right now, this was the one thing he had the most fun with. It was his outlet. Derek came from a small city in Nebraska. And while he had always been a loud and opinionated person in his private life, he'd never really had a proper platform to share all the big ideas and viewpoints that were constantly swirling in his head. This column for the Daily Nebraskan gave him that chance. It was his opportunity to finally present these ideas to the thousands of students at the university. He hoped his words would spark lively discussions and debates all around campus. After all, Derek loved a good debate more than anything. He thrived on it. So he would intentionally choose to write about really complex, often controversial issues. He knew these topics would get his readers fired up. He wrote about the ongoing war in Iraq. He wrote about the future of the Republican Party. He wrote about all the things he believed were wrong with local politics. The tone he used when he wrote about these contentious subjects was always very sarcastic. It was blunt, and it was deliberately provocative. He enjoyed creating a stir, getting people to passionately disagree with him, and they almost always did. It was common for the newspaper to receive furious letters to the editor after one of Derek's columns was published. Sometimes he'd even get personal hate mail. But Derek was never bothered by any of that. In a way, getting people that riled up was exactly what he was aiming for. It meant they were listening. It meant his words had an impact. And he was absolutely certain that the article he was writing right now in this moment was going to be even more divisive than anything he had written before. For Derek, the central theme that connected all of his beliefs was individual freedom. He was a fierce advocate for encouraging people to say no to what he saw as government overreach in their daily lives. That was his core principle, the thing that inspired him to write in the first place. This particular column he was working on was about a set of state and federal laws that he felt tried to control personal choice. He believed these laws infringed on a person's right to decide what was best for their own body, and he was arguing for them to be abolished completely. Now, to be clear, the stakes for this specific issue were literally life and death. But in Derek's view, the most fundamental freedom of being an American was the right to make your own decisions, even if those decisions meant risking your own personal safety. That was a risk he believed everyone should be free to take. And so, as Derek furiously typed away, he wasn't just stating his opinion, he was trying to rally people. He was encouraging everyone, from fellow students to senators and politicians, to have the same kind of intensity that he had about this issue. He wanted them to be fully bought in on this idea of American individual freedom. Finally, after what felt like hours of intense focus, he typed the last word. He leaned back in his chair, the squeak of the plastic echoing in the quiet corner of the lab. He took a deep breath and began to proofread the entire article from the beginning. He read each sentence carefully, making sure his arguments were sharp and his tone was just right. When he got to the very last line, he felt a genuine chill run down his spine. It said, quote, "I just wish we could keep the government out of our pocketbooks and out of our personal decisions." Derek loved that line. It was simple, direct, and powerful. He nodded to himself, a small, satisfied smile on his face. He had nailed it. He attached the document to an email and sent his draft to his editor. Derek's article went to print just a few days later, on the 17th of September 2004. And just as he had predicted, it caused an immediate uproar. Like most of his other articles, this one generated a flood of angry emails and letters from people who strongly disagreed with what he had to say. They called him reckless. They called him irresponsible. But all the anger, all the vitriol in these messages just proved to Derek that his article had been a huge success. He had sparked outrage. He had gotten people talking and arguing about this issue, which was exactly what he wanted. Derek even hoped that maybe some of the readers got angry enough to actually take action. That was his ultimate goal. He wanted his writing to genuinely inspire people, to make them think, and maybe even to change their behavior. The rest of Derek's semester was a total blur of activity. He kept writing his weekly column, piling it on top of all his other obligations. He had classes for his 5 majors, fraternity meetings, student government sessions, and his job at the library. Then came final exams. Before he knew it, the semester was over, and he was on his way to his mother's house in Texas for the Christmas break. A few weeks later, on the very early morning of the 4th of January, 2005, at around 3 a.m., Derek was riding in the back seat of a Ford Explorer SUV. He was on his way back to school after the break. He had caught a ride from his mother's home with 2 of his fraternity brothers who were sitting up front. The driver was focused on the dark road ahead, and the other friend was in the passenger seat trying to stay awake. It was an awful 13-hour-long drive. Derek had spent the first part of the trip doing what he did best. He was using his sharp sarcasm to make his friends laugh. He was engaging them in really animated conversations about politics, school, and their plans for the upcoming semester. For the first 6 or 8 hours, the time had sort of flown by. But now, it was the middle of the night, and a heavy silence had fallen over the car. Everybody was just completely exhausted from the truly awful, long, monotonous drive. All any of them wanted to do at this point was just get back to campus, get out of the car, and sleep in their own beds. Eventually, they were getting close. They had finally crossed into Nebraska and were driving down Interstate 80. It was a snowy, cold highway, and the landscape outside the windows was dark and bleak. The university was not far now. Derek was genuinely excited to start the new semester. He'd had a nice, laid-back holiday. He had caught up on a lot of sleep and spent a lot of time just hanging out with his younger siblings. But Derek was not the kind of person who liked slowing down for very long. He was already feeling restless, eager to get back to his busy, structured life on campus. He was especially looking forward to getting back to writing his column. During his downtime over the break, he had brainstormed a bunch of potential new topics, but he wasn't sure if any of his new ideas were going to top the very controversial article that he had published back in September. People on campus were still talking about that one. And Derek was still thinking about it too. In fact, his own words, his own advice to his readers were still ringing in his ears. They weren't just words on a page for him, they were a philosophy that guided his everyday decisions. But for now, with the campus just a few miles away, Derek just leaned his head up against the cold glass of the window and waited for this long trip to finally be over. He closed his eyes for a moment, the low hum of the engine and the tires on the pavement lulling him. But then, suddenly, he felt the SUV lurch violently to one side. Before he even had time to process what was happening, he heard a deafening bang as metal scraped against asphalt. He heard his friends in the front seats screaming. The world outside the window became a spinning blur of darkness and snow. Just a few minutes later, a police officer was flying down that same stretch of Interstate 80 inches, his cruiser, his lights flashing, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. He had gotten a call about a single-vehicle rollover. As he got closer to the location, he saw a group of ambulances parked on the side of the road, their own emergency lights bathing the snowy landscape in red and blue. He knew that's where he needed to go. So, he pulled his cruiser over to the side and stopped behind the last ambulance. When he got out, the bitter cold hit him instantly. He saw it then. In a ditch just off the highway was an overturned SUV, its wheels pointing up at the dark sky. The officer immediately jumped out of his cruiser and rushed towards the wreck. When he got there, the scene was absolutely chaotic. A team of paramedics was already at the window of the SUV, trying to assess the condition of the victims inside and figure out the best way to get them out. The officer knelt down to look inside as well. Through the shattered glass, he could clearly see two people inside the vehicle. They were the two young men who had been in the front. Both of them seemed, for the most part, okay. Obviously, they had been in a serious wreck. They were banged up, covered in small cuts, and clearly dazed and in shock. But their injuries didn't look immediately life-threatening. Relieved, the officer backed away to let the paramedics do their work. He started taking in the rest of the scene, getting ready to secure the area and start his report. But then, very quickly, the officer noticed that more paramedics were running right past the SUV. They were heading towards something on the ground a few feet beyond it, deeper in the snowy ditch. The officer's feeling of relief vanished. He followed them to see what it was they were running to. And when he saw what was on the ground, the officer just stopped. He was a veteran officer, he had seen a lot in his career, and he knew instinctively that there was nothing anyone could do for the person lying there. It was the body of a young man, clearly the third passenger from the SUV. His body was mangled, almost beyond recognition, from being thrown from the vehicle during the crash. It would turn out that Derek Keeper had been right. His September 17th highly contentious column in the Daily Nebraskan would be his most controversial and famous piece ever. In fact, people are still talking about it today. Because his column, the one he was so proud of, the one that argued that Americans have the right to make their own choices about their bodies and their personal safety, was about one law in particular. Derek believed that the law forcing people to wear a seatbelt was a direct infringement on that right. Derek despised this requirement. He thought the choice to wear a seatbelt should be a personal decision about risk and safety, not a mandate from the government. To him, it wasn't just about buckling up. It was about individual choice. It was about freedom. And on January 4th, when the SUV that Derek was riding in hit a patch of black ice on the road, the driver lost control. The driver and the other passenger in the front seat were wearing their seatbelts. But Derek, in the back seat, in keeping with his deeply held beliefs, was not. And so, when the SUV crashed and flipped over, Derek alone was ejected from the vehicle. Derek alone was killed. As one reporter later pointed out, Derek Keeper lived by his beliefs, and he also died by them. As tragic as Derek Keeper's story was, he was far from the only person whose deeply held beliefs would end in disaster. Because sometimes the most catastrophic decisions are made by people who are absolutely convinced they are in control. And in 2012, on the coast of Italy, one man's reckless confidence would lead to one of the most infamous maritime disasters in modern history. Just before 9 p.m. on Friday, the 13th of January, 2012, a 51-year-old man named Francesco Schettino and his girlfriend, Domenica, sat at a table in a crowded restaurant. They were at a massive resort in Italy, and they had been there for a while, enjoying a long, leisurely meal. Their table was covered with empty dishes, a half-empty wine decanter, and plates with the last remnants of their amazing food. Now, having an extended, indulgent dinner like this one was not technically allowed since Francesco was actually on the clock. But Francesco wasn't too worried about breaking what he considered to be a small rule. Because he wasn't just some hired hand at this resort. He was in charge of the entire thing. He was the boss. The resort was on Italy's beautiful Tuscan coast, and it was incredible. It was literally right out on the water. It had thousands of guest rooms, 6 different restaurants, and over a dozen bars. It had a full-size theater, multiple swimming pools, and there was even a casino on board. It had a huge capacity for guests. And right at that moment, there were easily more than 3,000 people staying there. Francesco was very proud to be the man in charge of this unbelievable place. He had actually started working at this resort years ago as a simple security guard. But he was ambitious, and he had worked his way all the way up to the very top. He had now been overseeing this property for about 6 years. Being a leader, being the one who gave the orders, really suited his personality. He loved being impressive. He loved feeling important. He had heard the whispers from his staff and from former coworkers. They complained that he was too over the top, that he was a bit of a show-off. He had heard all of it. But in Francesco's mind, these people were just jealous. He was handsome. He had a great high-paying job. And he had 2 beautiful, amazing women in his life when some people didn't even have one. And so now, Francesco smiled at one of those women, Domenica, who sat across the table from him. They were sharing a dessert. Francesco was married, but recently, Domenica had become the most important woman in his life. She was a dancer, and to him, she was just perfect. They had only met a few weeks ago, so they were still in that honeymoon phase of their relationship. They were both still very flirtatious and constantly eager to impress one another. Right now, Francesco knew he should probably leave the restaurant and get back to his managing duties. But he was having so much fun with Domenica. He didn't want the night to end. So he lingered, eating his dessert as slowly as he possibly could. But as he sat there, slowly dragging his spoon through the tiramisu, an idea started to form in his head. He realized that their night together didn't actually have to end just because dinner was over. There was something he could do right now that would give them maybe another hour or so together. And it wasn't just that. This idea would also completely blow Domenica away. It would prove to her beyond any doubt just how amazing and powerful he really was. So suddenly, a big smile spread across his face. He looked at Domenica and told her to hurry up and finish eating because they needed to get upstairs immediately. He had a surprise for her. A few minutes later, Francesco and Domenica hurried into the resort's top-floor operations center. And just like the entire rest of the place, this room, despite being an operations center, was still massively impressive. In addition to all the new high-tech equipment, the monitors showing security feeds, the glowing digital maps all over the room, there was this huge window. It took up almost an entire wall and overlooked an exterior balcony that looked down on the dark ocean below. It was a beautiful, sweeping view of the water, and it even overlooked a stretch of small, twinkling seaside villages on the coast called Giglio. The room was also filled with all of Francesco's employees. They were hustling around, staring at screens, and talking quietly into headsets. But as soon as Francesco and Dominica walked in, Francesco strode to the center of the room. He clapped his hands together, getting everybody's attention, and told them all to listen up. Then, he went over the details of his big idea. The resort was going to put on a very specific and spectacular kind of show. It was called a salute, and they were going to do it right now. Salutes were a very popular tradition in this particular area of Italy, and Francesco's resort actually did them all the time, so this wasn't a totally unusual request. They were basically a kind of performance, mostly for the benefit of the locals on shore. The resort would flash all of its lights and play loud music, while the guests of the resort would be encouraged to go to their balconies and wave and cheer to the residents and the other tourists in the villages of Giglio. But critically, salutes needed to be both quick and highly choreographed. That's the only way they worked. They were complex maneuvers. In order for a salute to be successful, it required the full attention and active participation from a large number of people on the staff. It was a big to-do. And given the fact that these were such a big endeavor, it meant that a lot could go wrong if you weren't extremely careful. Francesco actually had a mentor, a more experienced manager, who had actively discouraged him from doing these salutes. He had told Francesco to do as few of them as possible because of the risk involved. But Francesco's mentor wasn't physically here right now to tell him to stop. And the people who were here, his staff, seemed pretty excited about his spontaneous idea. So Francesco began going over the plan with them. And as he expected, with such a complicated undertaking, there were a lot of logistics to look over, a lot of charts to check. However, when Francesco actually started trying to go over these preparations, he realized he had a problem. He couldn't actually read anything. He hadn't brought his glasses with him. He didn't think he looked handsome when he wore them, so he had left them in his room before going out to dinner with Dominica. But now, he really needed them to read the fine print on the navigational charts. Thinking on his feet, Francesco simply turned to a junior staff member and asked him to read aloud whatever information he really needed to know in order to perform this salute. The staff member, a bit surprised, did as he was told. He read off the key data points and the recommended course adjustments. At the end of it, Francesco felt like he had heard what he needed to hear. He thought everything was in order. He nodded confidently and said, "Okay, we are all set to begin." Then he looked over at Dominica and gave her a smile and a little nod, as if to say, "Okay, here we go." "Get ready to be amazed." She smiled back, knowing that whatever was coming next was going to be really, really special. When Francesco gave the actual order to begin the salute, everybody in the operations room jumped into action. As soon as the salute officially began, Francesco squinted, trying to see through the huge window that looked out over the ocean and the village of Giglio down below. Francesco was so excited when he thought about how everyone who was out and about in town would look up and see his palace, all lit up and full of life and energy. He imagined their awe. But as he peered at the distant lights of Giglio, he realized something wasn't quite right. Even without his glasses on, he could see that there was something out there in the darkness, just barely illuminated by the town's lights. It was a large, dark shape right between his resort and Giglio. And to his growing horror, Francesco realized it was actually getting closer, and it was getting closer fast. At the exact same time, but on the other side of the resort, an American man named Brian Aho was eating dinner with his wife and their teenage daughter. They were in the Milano restaurant, which was one of the 6 main restaurants in the resort. They had just been enjoying their meal, talking about their vacation, when there was a deafening, grinding, banging sound. The entire room gave a huge, violent jolt, and everything inside just went flying. Brian instinctively grabbed the table to brace himself as plates and glasses shot off the tabletop and shattered on the floor all around them. Then he heard screams and the thud of people hitting the ground as other diners were literally thrown from their chairs. And then there was another series of loud crashes as some of the decorative ceiling panels came loose from above and smashed down onto the ground. But then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. The shaking abruptly stopped. Brian immediately jumped up to make sure that his wife and daughter were okay. They did seem to be fine, just dazed and terrified like everybody else in the room. As Brian stood up, he could tell he was mostly okay too, just shaken up. But the overwhelming thought in his mind was just having no idea what had just happened. He looked around the chaotic dining room, and no one seemed to know. It had felt like some kind of earthquake. But then Brian thought, if this had been an earthquake, he really had to get his family out of this restaurant immediately in case of aftershocks. It seemed like all the other diners clearly had the same idea. Before Brian could even really decide what to do, there was a surge of activity around him as dozens of people just began rushing towards the main exit of the restaurant. Brian didn't want him or his family to get caught in the middle of that huge, panicked crowd. A panicked group of people could easily create a stampede, and he was worried that he and his family could get pulled to the ground and trampled in the chaos. So he quickly looked around and saw on the other side of the restaurant a smaller service door that nobody else was going to. He pointed to it, and he and his family began making their way over to it. But before they could actually get through this door, the main overhead lights in the restaurant began to flicker. And then they went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. And with the darkness suddenly came the loud, piercing blast of emergency alarms echoing through the resort. And then he could hear more screams, not just from inside this restaurant, but from all over the place. It sounded like the entire resort had devolved into madness. Brian had never been more scared in his whole life. His pulse was racing faster than he thought was even possible, and he almost felt paralyzed, like this was just too much to even process. He, like basically everyone else, had no clue what was really going on here. Navigating his family through an emergency was already going to be horrifying and dangerous. But now he would also have to do it in the dark. For a long moment, Brian and his family just stood there, frozen in the dark. Brian was about to tell his family to just go through the door, that they'd figure it out in the dark. But then, luckily, the emergency lights flickered on, giving the room a dim, eerie glow. It wasn't much, but it was enough to see, enough to guide their way. At that point, Brian didn't wait. He grabbed his wife and his daughter, pushed through the side door, and they headed out into a long, narrow hallway. It would take nearly 10 minutes for Brian and his family to navigate the maze of hallways they had just walked into. The floor felt strange beneath their feet, like it was tilted at a slight angle. Finally, they found a door that led outside, and they stepped out into the open air. But when they finally got out there, Brian realized they actually had a really big problem. The exit they had just taken hadn't led them to safety. It had led them to an expansive outdoor terrace with a railing on the 4th floor of the resort. This meant they still needed to get down multiple levels in order to evacuate safely. But just being on the 4th floor wasn't the biggest issue. The big issue was that the terrace was already packed with hundreds of other people, other guests from the resort who were also trying to evacuate. There were all these people basically blocking their way to any potential staircase. Everybody who had no idea what was going on was just pushing and shoving each other. There were no authority figures, no staff members around to actually direct what was now clearly an evacuation. Brian could tell that the crowd was starting to panic, and honestly, he was too. Everyone was just shouting, "What's happening? What's going on?" And so Brian was about to suggest to his family that they turn around and try to find another way out when they heard the crackling of the resort's public speaker system. A calm voice came on and finally delivered some information about what was happening. The voice said that there had been an electrical blackout, but everything was fine. Technicians were hard at work trying to fix the problem. So, in the meantime, all the guests should stay calm and just go back to their rooms for safety. At this point, it was very obvious that the mood all around Brian and his family completely changed. People stopped pushing and arguing and panicking. The tension on the terrace just seemed to dissolve. Brian himself felt that tight knot of dread in his stomach loosen a bit. An electrical blackout didn't seem like a life-or-death situation. So, he, and clearly everybody else, felt a whole lot less scared. Pretty much right away, many of the guests began heading back inside, making their way back to their rooms. Brian even spotted a few staff members who had appeared in the crowd, encouraging people to do just that. Go back to your rooms, everything is under control. And so for a few moments, Brian and his family and the others who remained just kind of stayed put, watching things settle back down. But then, with no warning at all, there was another huge banging sound from deep within the structure of the resort. The floor once again buckled violently under Brian's feet. And this triggered a whole new wave of just absolute chaos out on the terrace. All at once, everybody started shouting and pushing each other again, this time in pure, unfiltered panic. At the same time, there were all these new frantic announcements coming out over the loudspeaker, but it wasn't doing anything. It was like the crowd had collectively decided that something was very, very wrong, and no one could tell them otherwise. They had to leave, right now. And so at this point, you had a group of people who were still out on the terrace who decided to charge back into the resort to try to find another way to evacuate. And you also had the group of people who had already gone back inside to go to their rooms who had now changed their minds, and they charged right back out onto the terrace. For a moment, it was like these two massive waves of people just smashed into each other. Brian and his family were kind of off to the side because they had just barely stepped out onto the terrace when all this was happening. But then Brian watched in complete shock as he saw some of the people, after they pushed and fought their way all the way to the edge of the terrace to the railing, they began climbing over it. They were going to try to climb down the outside of the resort from the 4th floor. Seeing this was horrifying for Brian. But then he felt yet another powerful shudder under his feet and a loud industrial groaning sound from the resort right behind him. And he knew in that instant, if he didn't do what these other people were doing, he and his family might not be able to evacuate. Clearly, there was a real, serious problem. They didn't know what it was, but they had to go. So, he grabbed his wife and his daughter's hands, and he shoved his way through the panicked crowd to the railing. Over the railing they went, and down they began to climb. Meanwhile, back up in the top-level operations center, Francesco Schettino was staring out the room's huge window, just completely frozen in shock. His resort was in complete pandemonium below. Guests were running everywhere. Others were fighting and shoving each other. And some were literally leaping to their potential deaths from the upper-level balconies and terraces. As Francesco watched all of this carnage unfold, he tried to wrap his head around how the night had gone so horrifically wrong. The worst part of all of it was that there was absolutely no way to fix it. He had been trying to show Dominica and everybody else how amazing and impressive and in control he was. But now he had completely lost control of this whole situation. He'd also lost his girlfriend because Dominica had quickly fled the resort as soon as the chaos started. Then there was another loud crashing sound somewhere in the distance. His heart pounded in his chest, and he realized it was time for him to start running too. Minutes later, Francesco and some of his senior staff were sprinting through the halls of the resort. And as they ran, thunderous noises and bangs came from every direction. The floor was tilted at an impossible angle. Debris from the ceiling and walls crashed to the ground all around them, shaken loose by the constant shuddering. And all the while, over the noise, Francesco could hear the continuous, terrified shrieks of panic from people who were still clearly trapped inside the resort and just couldn't get out. But he and the others he was with finally did make it to an exit. And this particular exit was not overrun with panicking people. So Francesco was lucky enough to be able to pretty quickly make it to the bottom level and then keep on going. And he did not look back, not until he was far, far away and what he believed was a safe distance. But when he did finally stop running, and he did turn around and look back at his resort, his stomach pitched so hard he nearly vomited. Because finally, standing on solid ground, he could see right in front of him the full, horrible extent of what he had done. It would turn out that what Francesco was looking at was the culmination of a record number of terrible choices he had made that night. One, Francesco would later deny this, but he was seen drinking alcohol at dinner while he was supposed to be working. Two, he was not wearing his glasses, which meant he was his most handsome self, but also that he couldn't see very well. And 3, he was distracted by his new girlfriend, who he had brought to an area where only key personnel were allowed, all because he was desperate to impress her. Now, in most workplaces, this would all just be considered unprofessional and maybe might get you fired. But in Francesco's workplace, it was much, much worse than that. What he had done was incredibly dangerous. Because the resort that Francesco managed was not a regular hotel, it was a gigantic cruise ship called the Costa Concordia. Francesco was its captain. And when he issued the order for the boat to do a salute, he was not just ordering a complicated but entertaining show. A cruise ship salute also involves steering the massive 114,000-ton boat much closer to shore than usual to appropriately show off to the locals on land. But because Francesco literally couldn't see very well, was obviously distracted, and possibly drunk, he didn't notice that when they performed this salute, they were going way too fast and way, way too close to the shore of Giglio. That dark shape he saw rushing towards them in the darkness was an enormous cluster of underwater rocks. By the time he saw it, it was far too late to turn. The Costa Concordia had smashed into the rocks, tearing a 230-foot wide hole in the side of the hull, which immediately began flooding the ship's engine rooms with seawater. And then, making matters even worse, Francesco delayed the rescue efforts for more than an hour by trying to convince everyone that what had happened was just a simple electrical outage. And then, when he finally did issue an evacuation order, he broke the most sacred rule for any ship captain. He fled the boat before the remainder of his crew and all the passengers. He was one of the first people to get into a lifeboat. He did not go down with his ship. That American passenger, Brian Apgar, and his family would survive. Because after they made the terrifying decision to go over the railing, they perilously climbed down 4 levels of the tilting, sinking ship all the way to a lifeboat. And so they survived. But unfortunately, 32 other people who were on board the boat that night ultimately died. All because of Francesco Schettino's reckless desire to show off for his girlfriend. Francesco himself was ultimately arrested for manslaughter and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. In the aftermath, he was subsequently named Captain Coward by the press and became known as Italy's most hated man. The terrifying part about both of these cases is that neither disaster began with evil intentions. They began with confidence, with ego, with the belief that nothing bad was going to happen. Thank you so much for watching. And if you want to see more stories where ordinary decisions spiral into unbelievable tragedies, we have an entire playlist waiting for you right now. Until next time. Before dawn on a quiet Saturday in March of 1997, a police captain was making his final patrol through the sleeping outskirts of a small town in North Carolina. The road, a stretch of highway that connected the town to the larger city of Charlotte, was almost completely empty. But up ahead, the captain saw something that didn't belong. There was a red Jeep parked oddly on the shoulder of the road, its headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. It was just sitting there. This was suspicious enough for the captain to slow down and pull his patrol car in behind it. He got out, the air cool and still, and started walking towards the Jeep. As he got closer, he could hear the low hum of the engine. It was still running. He saw the driver's side window was all the way down. But when he walked around to that side of the vehicle and shined his flashlight inside, he saw that nobody was there. The driver's seat was empty. The whole car was empty. He stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. And then a sound cut through the quiet. A cell phone, sitting on the passenger seat, began to ring. In the early morning hours of Saturday, the 29th of March 1997, a 26-year-old waitress named Kim Medlin was finishing up her shift. She worked at a topless bar in Charlotte called the Men's Club, and tonight she was wearing a leotard and tights as she carried a tray of filet mignons through the bustling, smoke-filled room. She navigated past the main stage, where women were dancing, and delivered the food to a table of businessmen. Kim worked here 3 or 4 nights a week, and for the most part, she didn't mind the job. The money was very good, and working the late shift meant her days were completely free. That freedom was important, because it let her focus on the two things she loved most in the world: taking care of her horses and turning her brand new house into a home. Kim and her husband, Bridger, had just achieved a major life goal. They'd bought a beautiful 7-acre plot of land just outside the nearby town of Monroe, which was where Bridger had grown up. They spent the better part of the last year building their dream home from the ground up. They even built a barn for their 3 horses. Now, with all the heavy construction finally done, they were in the middle of moving in, unpacking boxes, and making the place their own. As Kim delivered the stakes, she glanced up at a clock on the wall. She saw she had less than an hour to go, and a little wave of excitement went through her. She had the next 3 days off, and she had big plans. Simple plans